Welcome to everyone who's come here today. I'm really pleased that this event is taking place. My name is Anne Henshaw. I'm the chairman of the Wiltshire branch of the CPRE, which was known as the Campaign to Protect Rural England. We've renamed and rebranded, and we're now the Countryside Charity. CPRE has been closely following the progress of neighbourhood plans throughout all our branches nationally since their introduction in 2012, although 2011, I suppose, to be precise. Jeff Bishop, who is one of our speakers, worked with our Gloucestershire branch in 2018 on a research exercise. And I know that in the report on this work, one of the issues raised was that there was sorry, yes? You're on mute, Geraldine. Geraldine, you're on mute. Geraldine.
Could you all mute, because there's someone's talking in the background which is going over Anne's conversation. So if you could all make sure you mute, please.
Right, okay. Anyway, I was talking about Jeff. Anyway, in the report on this research exercise, one of the issues raised was that there was too much emphasis, guidance and support on getting the plans made and not enough on using them. And that the report also noted that strong guidance was needed to local authorities in terms of relationships and allocating sufficient resources, not just on technical issues. A question rising from this was, is there a disconnect between government policy, high-level strategic plans, local plans, and NDPs? In April 2021, CPRE National Office prepared a briefing paper which was sent to MHCLG as a result of having carried out wide consultation amongst leading academics and stakeholders in the field of neighbourhood planning. 6 key issues were identified as essential for NPs to succeed in delivering better planning outcomes. If followed, this would go some way to restoring public trust in the planning system. We emphasise that the volunteer nature of the MP and the extensive community engagement on which it is premised must be recognised when determining the timescales on which NPs are prepared and updated. It must also be recognised that neighbourhood plans make significant contributions towards the national priorities of building back better, levelling up, recovering nature, and mitigating and adapting to climate change. The 6 main issues which we submitted to the government department were extending participation, scope, status, relationship to other elements of the system, process, and resourcing and support. Now, interestingly, we'll see during the course of this morning, I hope, all those things that were noted by Jeff Bishop in 2018 and what we wrote this year to the government department, are they still the same or have they improved? I should be really interested to hear all these points from our speakers and from your questions and views as people who are very much within the process. I think that's enough for me, and I'll now hand over to Trevor.
Thank you very much, Anne. Hope everybody can hear me, and big welcome to everybody. And I hope that you're all in now. I know it's really difficult. We've got over 100 people here today, so it's quite an event. I'm chair of the Wiltshire Community Land Trust, which is an independent charity which supports local communities to build homes themselves, or to get homes built themselves to meet local needs, especially for affordable housing, especially for young people who can't afford to buy in our housing market, and other needs as well. But there's a close relationship between that, local housing needs, and doing neighbourhood plans, which is why we're supporting this conference today. Many of you will know, certainly of those of you who are involved in neighbourhood plans, that they're neither simple or quick, quite complicated. I hope today that we'll be able to pinpoint some of where those blockages are and the potential and opportunities. We've got two opening speakers who are very experienced up and down the country and in Wiltshire on working and advising on neighbourhood plans. So that's where we'll start from. But at national level, planning continues to be the subject of major reform. This has caused both alarm and uncertainty. Later, we'll hear from Hugh Ellis of the Town and Country Planning Association, of which I'm also a member, who, like the CPRE, have been at the forefront of campaigns for better planning. There's an awful lot to discuss in this, as you can imagine, and I must sound a warning note. We're not likely to resolve all these outstanding issues in one event, but what I hope we will do is obtain a clear picture of where we are, what the outstanding issues are and how we might be able to tackle them, and particularly here in Wiltshire. And may I say, after this conference, I hope that we will be producing some sort of note or report. We will be taking it to Wiltshire, and disappointed that they haven't been able to field someone for this event, but we'll be talking to them about the problems that arise, and also to government as well, both through the CPRE nationally and through Town and Country Planning Association, who are very involved with government on planning and so on. So we've got to, you know, put some pretty direct lines to government, which is useful, so we can get some of these messages back. Just on a personal note, I've been an advocate of community-led planning, you know, what we might call the bottom-up approach, all my professional life. So I'm especially interested in neighbourhood plans. Despite all the setbacks, we've really come quite a long way over the decades, and I hope this event will confirm that progress, especially here in Wiltshire. Just to note, just to repeat, really, ask questions through the chat box. Given the number, we're going to struggle to obviously to address all of them. We'll select as many as we can, but all questions will be noted and responded to, either individually or via the note I talked about at the end of this event. We won't lose them. A reminder also that amongst our numbers, there is a kind of secret panel, the panel of experts, which are drawn from, amongst others, the Community Land Trust Board, and they'll be available to add to or to address the questions along with the main speakers, of course, who will be the first to respond. But we also have other experts who can come in as and when, regardless. Okay, I think that's it. You've seen the programme. We've got Jeff Bishop and Anna Cronin kicking off. If there are any questions, discussions, a break, Hugh Ellis comes in from the national, then we've got some local experiences, and then we end up with an open forum again for a chance for more questions and discussions, so that I hope we can cover a lot of ground. Okay, I'll shut up there and hand over to Anna to take us, kick us off. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Geraldine, could you put our first slide up, please? And while Geraldine's doing that, I'm going to say that Jeff and I have put a joint presentation together. I'm hoping, Geraldine, it's going to come up. I'm sure you're working on it. Yeah, she is. Thank you. We've put a joint presentation together. It runs seamlessly from one to another. So I'm going to start by talking about the sort of national perspective, and then thank you, Geraldine, and then I'm going to hand over to Jeff, who's going to concentrate more on Wiltshire, what's been happening in Wiltshire. That's brilliant. Could we have the first slide, please, Geraldine? Thank you. Thanks. Right, starting as has already been said with the Localism Act in 2011, which introduced the system of neighbourhood plans and, of course, community right to build orders. New system, so training as well. This was promoted as a light touch way for communities to get the development that they want through neighbourhood plans and community right to build orders. And I think that was a rather dubious claim in some ways, as some speakers have already said. It's actually quite complicated. The community right to build orders have actually been relatively little used to date across the country as a whole. The locality grant aid programme and training was set up, but in the early days, I think it's fair to say that as well as that being aimed at local volunteers, it tended to be taken up mainly by local authority policy planners at local authority level. And I think that still has some implications for us. If we move on to the next slide, please. Clearly, the training was a resource, and my next slide is about resources. Guidance. We started off with not much guidance, and I think we've ended up with a very great deal of guidance, some of which is very general, some of which is outdated, and worse still, I think some of it is undated on websites, and that is particularly unhelpful, especially to volunteers in neighbourhood planning. It's hard enough for the professionals to work out whether it's still relevant or not, let alone for volunteers. There is, as already been said, an obligation in law for local planning authorities to support neighbourhood plans. That has actually been quite variable. Initially, there was funding, sorry about the noise, there was funding available for local authorities to sort of get the first 5 designations going in their area. But since most districts and counties now have more than 5 designated areas for neighbourhood plans, that money really has dried up, and the money really only applies to running a referendum at the end of the process. And that can be quite an expensive operation. The basic grant to the qualifying bodies has gone up to £10,000, which if you're a small parish is probably quite adequate. But of course, if you're doing a larger enterprise involving several parishes or perhaps a town council, that's probably not enough money. And indeed, that's been recognised by making additional grants for things like deprived areas, large population areas and multi-parish plans. These grants do vary from year to year, so it's worth looking to see what the national flavour is at the time that you're looking at the website. Technical support has also become available, and that is free. And I've listed there some of the issues that are supported by technical resource. But the thing to remember is that technical support through locality is tied to their retained consultants. And that might not be quite what you want. And the other incentive that's available is a financial one, which really only kicks in at the end of the process. Parishes do get 15% of community infrastructure levy where there's no made neighbourhood plan, and if you get all the way through the process, that goes up to 25%. But I have to say that none of the parishes I've worked with have seen 25% of community infrastructure levy on the development in their area as a particular incentive to doing a neighbourhood plan. They've usually got other reasons why they want to do it, although the money comes in handy. And of course, if there's not much development going on, you're not going to get much money anyway. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to look at activity across the country. But Jeff and I reckon there's probably potentially, if you count parishes and urban areas, about 20,000 potential neighbourhood areas who could do a plan. I'm not Mystic Meg. As you can see, there's a deliberate mistake there. The designations of neighbourhood areas didn't peak in the future at 2023. It peaked in 2013, which is hardly surprising because that's just a couple of years after the legislation came in and there was a rush to take advantage of it. We've now got more than 1,000 finished made plans. That's not a huge number, relatively speaking. Another 3,000 in various states of progress, some of which, let's face it, fruition. Again, I've been involved in a couple of those, or known of a couple of those, unless you think I jinx them all. 90% of those plans are in what you would call fairly wealthy areas. Neighbourhood plans, well, that hooray for that. And another one to encourage take up in areas which have fewer than the average neighbourhood plans. And this is an attempt to address the current imbalance, and we'll see what comes out of that. But I also think we should remember that just because you can do a neighbourhood plan doesn't mean you have to, or you need to, or you want to. Another planning tool might be better for you. If we could have the next slide, please. My next slide is going to look at activity across the whole of the country again. And as you can see, that varies terrifically. I've just chosen 3 areas there. Herefordshire really stands out. They had full corporate support. They thought this was a jolly good idea from the start. They supported neighbourhood plans with a team of 4 officers, which they've now reduced down to 1 because they've got such good coverage. But it's our impression that there's not many authorities who really go for it all out, like Herefordshire. Most are perhaps neutral, and they will respond positively when you approach them wanting to do a neighbourhood plan. It seems to depend very much on the officers of on the attitude of specific council members and officers. I would say from my work with local authorities as a liaison person, that it can be very difficult to maintain consistent officer support. As we've said, with volunteers, it takes quite a while to produce a neighbourhood plan. And by the time you've produced it, you're probably working with about your 3rd relatively junior officer. Officers move around, they move between authorities, they move even within the department. And in most cases, as I say, the external funding for neighbourhood planning to local authorities has dried up. Most of the early training was taken up and aimed at policy planners. And I don't think there's been so much emphasis on, if you like, encouraging and training development management staff in how to use neighbourhood plans. I think they've often had less exposure to neighbourhood plans. They may have come from an area which doesn't have them. And let's face it, sometimes the policies in neighbourhood plans are very difficult for an officer to interpret and apply. And I'm sure that doesn't apply to anybody here who's done a neighbourhood plan, but believe me, I have come across some. I've really had to scratch my head and think, well, what does this mean? So if we could have the next slide, please. I was going to go on to look at issues in neighbourhood plans. Housing. Housing always comes up. There's no precise figures, but we think that around half of neighbourhood plans actually allocate housing sites. And of course, others shy away from making allocations because it's too difficult. It's technically difficult, and it may be divisive in the community to do so. Where they do allocate housing, most of them actually allocate the given figure given to them by the local authority, or something fairly close to it. There are a few outstanding examples which allocate a great many more houses, and these tend to be where there's a strategic allocation in the local plan, and the neighbourhood plan is being used as a vehicle for the community to get more control over how that's built out and what it looks like and what it contains. They're quite a flexible mechanism, neighbourhood plans, and they can do all sorts of different things. So when we look at housing, obviously it tends to be less divisive and more popular, if I could put it that way, where the allocations and the policies can address specific community needs. And I'm sure you're going to hear from experts on that later in the session. As we've heard, affordable housing for local people is a common thread. Also, self or custom build is coming up as an issue. And both types of housing can include some market housing for sale to help float the boat, if you like, on affordable housing. Other issues which come up a lot are improving development quality, design and local distinctiveness. I don't think I've come across a neighbourhood plan that didn't have that somewhere in the mix. In areas where there's a lot of development pressure, protecting local green space, actually designating local green space to protect from development is an issue. And climate change has come up in quite a few neighbourhood plans. Until most recently, I think it was a case of local innovation compared with national inaction. I've seen quite a few neighbourhood plans that have actually really tried to take climate change seriously and include policies to deal with it in a small way in their community. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So you get your neighbourhood plan written and it goes to examination. Examiners are generally helpful and supportive, but they're not there to rewrite a wonky plan. And there are a few plans that actually fail at examination. And on the screen, you can see some of the reasons for that. But let's assume it gets through the examination and you get to referendum. And the referendum turnout is usually low when it's just an election, a referendum based on a neighbourhood plan. But where it's combined with another election, such as local elections, the turnout is usually the same for both, and it's higher, and the support is usually very good for neighbourhood plans. Where a plan fails at referendum, it's very unusual, and it's usually because the community is divided in some way. So a sort of failure of shared vision. Now, some neighbourhood plans, which were made early in the process, are actually being reviewed. Often that is to align with local plans. Local plans are required to be reviewed every 5 years. There's no such requirement on a neighbourhood plan. And we don't have any national figures for how many plans are in the process of review. And if the review doesn't require significant changes, you don't need to go through an examination again. Hooray! But it has to be said that the complicated national picture is influencing progress and thinking on reviews. There are issues about winding people up and marching them up to the top of the hill again in terms of neighbourhood plan steering groups, when, let's face it, not only do we have policy confusion at national level, but we've also had the pandemic to deal with, and people have had other things on their minds. So if we could move on to next slide, please. In the introduction, it was mentioned how useful and effective are neighbourhood plans. Strangely enough, there's not actually been that much research on this, but in the little bits of research that have been done, some by Play Studio, that's Jeff's outfit, and some by Student, it was found that some parish councils don't even refer to their own neighbourhood plan when they're commenting on planning applications. Well, having done all that work, why wouldn't you use it? And I know that I was asked by a parish council to run a briefing on their neighbourhood plan when it was made, just to remind everybody what was in it and remind them how to use it. And I've also done the same thing for development management staff on the content of another neighbourhood plan. And that might be something that's worth thinking about doing in terms of your neighbourhood plan. Examiners do vary in approach, and sometimes, as I say, policies get through which are not particularly well written. Sometimes that applies to boundaries. What looks really clear on an A4 document won't look so clear when it has to be blown up and applied to a large-scale site plan. And I've actually had a neighbourhood plan steering group chair say to me at the end of the process, "Oh, now I understand why boundaries are important." Yes. Having said that, there are loads of really good examples of neighbourhood plans being used in pre-application discussions as well as in planning decisions. And generally speaking, you can see that where they are seriously challenged, they are supported, generally speaking. So, moving on again, please, if we could have the next slide, please. Thinking about what are our challenges. Well, the first one I've already mentioned, neighbourhood plans reactivating and winding themselves up again, but they may have lost impetus. They may have lost key volunteers. The policy landscape has changed and is very much more confused. We had the white paper in 2020, which everybody was very worried about. We then had a Secretary of State change. We've had levelling up come in, and maybe that will actually, some people think that might reduce the focus on planning per se. It might, of course, go the other way. We've had mixed messages from government about what's going to happen. We've had the Secretary of State, Gove, the current incumbent, announcing a pause on the planning bill. If you look back to the white paper proposed keeping neighbourhood plans, but refocusing them particularly around design, digital tools, and possibly even street level plans, which makes my heart sink, I must say. Right, moving ahead, if we could have the next slide, please.
Does that go?
Yes, I'm sure it will come up in a minute, Geraldine, if you give it a press. It'll come up in a second. Meanwhile, yes, setting housing targets is a huge issue. Setting housing targets is a huge issue for local planning authorities, who are then supposed to hand down a figure to any neighbourhood plan group who wants a figure to give them something to aim for and to allocate. We are all having to meet this top-down national target of 300,000 houses per year. There's a very complex formula to be used by local planning authorities to determine what their housing figure should be, which has already been amended twice and may potentially be amended again in the future, perhaps even to sort of assist the levelling up agenda. So it's not an easy situation, and it's certainly not easy when you're trying to put your neighbourhood plan together. The National Planning Policy Framework, that's NPPF, is encouraging particularly small and medium-sized allocations in neighbourhood plans as part of the kind of effort nationally to widen the housing market away from the volume house builders and to encourage more smaller operations. And of course, that can work very well with self-build and also with community projects. So that's a real positive that you might want to think about. And I've said that the white paper actually mentioned having yet another version of the national housing target formula approach, but there was no detail about that, as with most things in the white paper. Housing land supply is another really thorny issue. It's very complex because local planning authorities are obliged to maintain a 5-year supply of housing land. And if they don't have one, it has implications for how far neighbourhood plans can be supported. And I think that this is one of the issues that's leading some neighbourhood plans to think they must do a review, because if you've got less than a 5-year supply at local authority level, but there is a made neighbourhood plan, and the neighbourhood plan is recent and contains housing allocations, and the local planning authority have delivered at least 45% of what they were required to deliver over the last 3 years, and the local planning authority has at least a 3-year housing land supply, then your neighbourhood plan stands, as opposed to the presumption in favour of sustainable development in the National Planning Policy Framework. And if you found that little explanation confusing, you're not the only one. And I sometimes think that it's just like some sort of magic formula, and if there's an R in the month and the moon is waning, something else will change. It's an extremely complex situation and very difficult, I think, for neighbourhood planning groups and parish and town councils. However, let's be a little bit more optimistic. Looking ahead, if we could have the next slide, please. Looking ahead, emphasis on design has come up the agenda at national level, and it's really clear in the NPPF that neighbourhood plans can include design guides and design codes, and that's a real opportunity, I think, and I'm sure Jeff will have something to say about that. But of course, you know, what's given with one hand may be taken away with another. Permitted development rights, which have changed and loosened recently, may cut across what you want for your area, particularly with things being extra stories being added without the need for full planning permission. And I'm sure Jeff will have something to say about people who want design guides, but don't want to do a full-on neighbourhood plan with all the bureaucracy. We've now got first homes being thrown into the mix and encouragement for neighbourhood plans to bring forward sites for these. These are a form of affordable housing, but for sale to first-time buyers at discounted rates, but the discount remains in perpetuity. And many local plans, as I've said, are thinking about, many local plans are under review, making it difficult for the neighbourhood plans to work out what it is they're actually trying to generally conform to. So it's a difficult situation at the moment. It is confused. And I'm hoping that if I hand over to Jeff with the next slide, he's going to bring illumination to us all. So I hope I haven't depressed you too much. Pointed out a few opportunities. Geraldine, can we have the next slide and Jeff can take over? Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thanks to Anna for that presentation of the national picture. And hello to a good number of people I know out there, well, who either know me or know my Play Studio colleagues from our work in Wiltshire, including some whose faces I've never seen before. So that's nice to see. So having done the national picture, I'm going to take over by focusing in on Wiltshire, once again looking at the picture today and then looking ahead. And I'll then make a few final comments on both of us. You can see here on the slide that around 32% of Wiltshire parishes and towns have made plans or plans on their way. That puts Wiltshire, if you remember Anna's slide, just about in the middle in terms of coverage. Several places are into review. Just for example, my colleagues and I in Play Studio are currently working with Carlton and Warminster. It's our impression that it is the larger places like those that are moving into review because of development pressures. And especially, as with Malmesbury, because the short-term land supply protection has now gone, or will soon go for others, and it's back to the unprotected 5-year supply situation, which puts them at prejudice there. As you can also see, for Wiltshire's 260 plus parish areas, there's one full-time officer, as compared with the original 4 full-time for Herefordshire, with a similar number of parish areas. And some much smaller districts have also one full-time person. So perhaps that seems a little low, but every neighbourhood plan group in Wiltshire is allocated a link officer, and to our knowledge, very few other local authorities do that. So it's not easy to be sure, but maybe the support overall for Wiltshire is actually quite good. But from our experience, the amount and quality of that support, though always good, varies significantly. It can vary significantly from link officer to link officer. Very often those in the policy area within the county can answer questions directly. Most commonly, if we have a development management person as the link officer, that person then needs to check back with someone else. But as I say, the contact is good. Finally, Wiltshire are not alone in having a rather out-of-date website. Next slide, please. So the first bullet point outlines broadly the geography of where it appears that the majority of plans in Wiltshire are made or on their way. And that takes us back again, we suspect, to the development pressure issue. The smallest parish we've ever worked with was Seagree, population 285. Well, it was yesterday, at maybe 286 today, okay? And they really just about managed with the full basic grant, probably in fact didn't even need the full basic grant, and it was 8K at that time. We're now working with, amongst others, Aldbourne, population 2,000, just about managing with the old basic grant, and Cologne, population around 3,000, basic grant, yes, but design code top-up grant, but also bigger places such as Westbury, population around 17,000, basic grant for now, thinking about possible grant top-up on design, maybe for allocations work. What we're finding is that some larger places and even some smaller ones are nevertheless needing to also dip in to the precept pot. Just for information, we're part of a national network lobbying for changes on this one at the moment. As Anna has suggested, settling specific housing target figures for neighbourhood plan areas is difficult, even more so while we await details of the government's latest approach. In my view, the methodology for calculating such figures actually runs out of usefulness at parish town level. It's good at the broad brush level, but really isn't good enough at that very local level. Now you can, of course, do a calculation for yourselves for your NDP, and the locality guidance is reasonably easy to follow. But beware, on one occasion, a plan group who did not like the figure from Wiltshire did their own calculation, and it ended up higher. And please don't start me on the value of results of affordable social housing from housing needs assessments. I really don't want to get into that one. As you'll probably also know, the Wiltshire Community Land Trust is very active across the area, and that work is supported by staff at Wiltshire Council. And you'll no doubt hear about that from Seand and Broad Chalk later, two communities with whom my colleagues, not myself, have actually worked with. As for self and custom build, it's progressing across the country, only occasional rather than regular for now. Next slide, please. Now let's look ahead for Wiltshire. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that the local plan review is underway, but exactly how to play your neighbourhood planning work in association with Wiltshire's work is extremely difficult for everybody, as Anna has also hinted. The review is delayed, partly a resource issue, partly a problem of waiting for the government to draw conclusions on lots of aspects, such as community and infrastructure levy, not just housing numbers. From my recent work with government, I got some worrying hints that some aspects of the growth agenda that they promised may not have been binned completely. If, for example, one large town in Wiltshire that we know of became a growth area, there are developers eyeing up land there for tens of thousands of houses. Clearly, some sites would be just plain daft, but even if a quarter of what was put forward in the SHELAR process went ahead under the growth principles, that would be any semblance of good planning down the drain completely. And even if growth areas never materialise, a good few of your neighbourhood areas are also in areas where strategic growth looks like being allocated. The government's official guidance in such circumstances is that Wiltshire policy officers should work very closely with you and proactively, not just waiting for you to make a fuss. That can work really well for both parties, as we know from one very interesting example recently. And yet, hovering in the background is still that issue that Wiltshire does not currently have a 5-year housing land supply. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. So all of you remain open to the worst of the wrong type of predatory development on the wrong site with dismal design. And even if you have a made plan, as we've said, you're only protected for a short while, which is why developers are currently queuing up, waiting to pounce the moment that protection period ends for those who've already got made plans for a few years old. This last point also needs a very topical additional comment about something that is affecting a lot of areas very much in Wiltshire. Very topical issue. And that issue is the implications of working from home, which everybody says is now with us for good. That's already creating, as in the title of a TV programme, a massive escape to the country. I've just heard of one estate agent in Derbyshire with 150 houses on their books and a waiting list of 11,000 people. That list was 1,100 just 3 years ago. This trend runs up against the long-established and now government-reinforced principle about sustainability that favours consolidation in large urban areas and resistance to fragmented developments in the countryside, very relevant to Wiltshire. But can it be stopped? Because after just a quick look, it already seems to be having the effect in much of Wiltshire of raising house prices significantly. That's damaging generally, and as we know from Cornwall in particular, deeply damaging for those on low incomes wanting to get their own properties. Should Wiltshire be addressing this? How might it, how should it affect their housing calculations? Should they go with the flow and just allow, even encourage more of it? And how and who will then pick up the tab for those in need of affordable housing? Although one has to say this has a flip side. More people working from home is already shown, there is evidence to show that that is helping to support local shops and other facilities, especially in villages and small towns. Next slide, please. Okay, now for the final look ahead. As we know from experience, with every one of the communities in Wiltshire that we've worked with, design quality, especially junking anywhere housing for locally distinctive housing, is a real priority. There is now the new National Model Design Code, but it's almost entirely focused on projects in very large towns and cities. It is absolutely and hopelessly useless for your smaller and often more rural communities. Work on the code should start at authority level, though the prospect of a single design code for all of Wiltshire is terrifying. That's not local distinctiveness. Although I've asked, the impression I'm getting is that nothing is yet happening from County Hall. Once again, very happy to be corrected if I'm out of date. So it's now down to you at neighbourhood level, which is exactly as it should be, because local really should mean local in design terms. That's because, just as one example, Cologne, where we're working, and its immediate neighbour village, Biddestone, could almost not be more different in their layout and character. And the challenge for you is to demonstrate that in your design work, avoiding the banality of a policy that just says respect local character. You need to work hard to describe your distinctive character in real detail, for which there are loads of methods and people to help you. And oh yes, you may even get an extra grant pot of up to £8,000 to do so. And as Anna's hinted, all of that's fine for areas doing neighbourhood plans. But what if you just want, as several communities in Wiltshire have come to us with a question about, you just want to do a character assessment or a design statement, not a whole lengthy, tedious neighbourhood plan. At the moment, you can't get any grant aid support. We're working on that nationally as well. There may be an answer to that, although I'd probably have to shoot you if I told you that, so contact me later or maybe ask a question. Finally, last slide, please, some summary points. Okay, finally, summary points from Anna and me. I'm just going to read through them and then make a final comment. It's not noted on the presentation here, and as I do it, you'll probably no doubt realise why I haven't put it on the slide. Neighbourhood plans are here to stay, but ignore Gove's lunatic comment about making them universal. They are lengthy, they are time-consuming, they are bureaucratic, and for larger places, sometimes expensive. But they are worth it when done well, and they are getting better because we are all, including Anna and me, learning how to achieve that. And if you want to know whether they work, ask yourself why is there that sudden rush in developer activity when work starts on a new neighbourhood plan? It's because they're terrified of losing their influence. Maximum effectiveness will, however, as Anna has also said, require a more proactive and a more collaborative approach and relationship with local planning authorities. And yet those local planning authorities are massively under-resourced and in limbo while government dithers. So, taking that last point, my extra for today, like all planning authorities, Wiltshire have lost between 60 and 80% of their planning team resources since 2010. This inevitably raises questions about the amount of resource allocated to neighbourhood planning, and in some ways it is not the highest priority. But let's look at that another way. Anna has pointed out the funding available to Wiltshire's work on neighbourhood plans and what's available to communities who produce them. Adapting research from the good old days of parish and town plans, the amount of community time committed to a single neighbourhood plan could be valued at around £40,000 to £50,000 using what are called sweat equity rates. So, if as now around 40 plans are in preparation at any one time, that means the equivalent of nearly £2 million of resource is available and being committed in Wiltshire to local level planning. And it's at that local level through neighbourhood plans that most could be done about that working from home affordability dilemma. So attribute more officer time to promoting and supporting, let's say, 100 more neighbourhood plans, and that figure of 2 million could be more than doubled. That is absolutely staggering value for money. So right now, when the future nature of local plans is so uncertain, it seems to me a total non-brainer not to add work to Wiltshire's council's resources to better support all of you for even more and even better neighbourhood plans. And as some of our other work has shown, this can, and I quote, transform the relationships between communities and planners for the better. I hope that's a positive point to finish on. Final slide, please. Thank you. Trevor and there.
Well, thank you very much for that, both of you. I hope everyone is feeling a mixture of inspiration and perhaps some slight depression Anyhow, most interesting. So we'll now go through, Trevor and I are going to go through questions that people have been asking in the chat. We'll go for ones that are positively questions, and then work our way through what is more the sort of comment, and perhaps discuss that briefly. So shall I start by asking, I think it's from Tony Nicklin. Anna said there was no legal need for an NP to be reviewed once made. I thought that it was a necessary part of continuing to receive the 25%. Please confirm if I have misunderstood. So Anna, that's directed to you.
That's an interesting one. I don't, to be honest with you, the community infrastructure levy regulations are so complex that I wouldn't even attempt to work my way through those. But definitely local plans are under an obligation to review every 5 years. I'm pretty sure there is no obligation on neighbourhood plans to do the same thing, although you obviously need to keep an eye on what's happening. You need to see whether your plan is being effective. You need to monitor it. And if it's not, you need to think about changing it in some way. If you like, I will check later on the relevant part of the neighbourhood, National Planning Policy Framework, and on the chat I'll put the paragraph reference up.
Okay.
Right. Does Tony want to add anything further to that, or shall we move on to the next question?
Tony speaking. No, thank you very much, Anna.
Okay.
Hello, Tony.
Ian Mitchell is asking a question about move to working from home seems to be essential for levelling up opportunity in a dispersed economy. Does this make linking housing, employment and the infrastructures for living, such as education and medical, key parts of neighbourhood plans? Anna, Jeff put his finger up.
Yeah, it's getting very interesting for us at the moment, because it's relating also to work we're doing elsewhere, not in your area, but over in Lydney in Gloucestershire, on regeneration of the town centre. So you've got a small town centre currently struggling because of COVID and other implications, etc. And we're looking at that in terms of working from home and the pros and cons and benefits. And there are, looking at the research that's been going on nationally, it's very early days, very significant benefits. And you're absolutely right. There is a connection, not just looking at the housing issues, but looking at, say, education. It is changing, for example, what's the other authority up in towards the north? I think not Lincolnshire, somewhere there. They are now having to reconsider some of their plans for the closure of rural schools because of an increased demand for schooling, primary school education in the rural areas as a result of people working more from home and moving to houses that enable them to work from home. So there is a connection from that. In Lydney, one of the examples we're developing, for example, and you could do in a very small village, small town, is what I call a working near home hub. In other words, a space in the village or town centre where people who work from home in premises that perhaps are too small for them to work from home or inappropriate can nevertheless come to the village centre, let's say in a little space above the local shop, as maybe a hot desk place. They can meet there, they can work from there, and lo and behold, what do? They get their sandwiches and their coffee from the shop down below, and they still don't have to travel to work when they need. So I think there is a real need, statistically, organisationally quite difficult to prove, a need link between housing, employment and services such as education, and I guess even health.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I just add on to that, interesting for Jeff's comment, because the other day I was driving up through Warwickshire and I went through a village which has converted a former agricultural barn just on the edge of the village into exactly that, a working from home unit, and they've got a farm shop which is growing. They have seen some housing development, but the great thing is there is in one particular village proper sustainable living. So I think that's a really good outcome that could happen. So we'll go on to the next question, which is from Graham Tricky. What is the panel's view of the benefits versus effort to create a first neighbourhood plan for a small village, which is somewhat protected in the planning system because it is defined as a small village. I'm not quite sure, do you mean it's a village, it must have a boundary, presumably it's got a village boundary, and perhaps, Graham, you could explain a little bit more, but we'll then get an answer for you.
Yeah, then the planning system, the village I'm talking about, I live in, is Kington Langley, which is just south of Seagree, that was mentioned as one of the small parishes. So it's pretty small, it's about 600 people. At the moment, we don't have a neighbourhood plan. And we are protected from huge development sites at the moment by the fact that we are a small village.
Marlon. Bye.
We are a small village. So really what I was asking is, we're struggling with the benefits. We realise that there are some benefits of doing a neighbourhood plan, but it's a lot of work. And we're just looking for other people's views on, whether that's worthwhile for a parish of our size. Thank you.
Right. Well, can I turn to either maybe Anna on this one?
If I start and then Jeff comes in because he knows the Wiltshire, scene better. I think I understand the kind of policy approach you're talking about. The thing I would say is, if you're fully protected, that may not be what you need to do, a full neighbourhood plan. You might still think that there is merit in canvassing your residents and your businesses about what are the issues that bother them, and then perhaps that leads you to much more towards the design approach that Jeff was talking about, or even some sort of parish action plan, not a neighbourhood plan, but a parish action plan that can be much more about something that the parish council uses for advocacy purposes. And once you've got one of those, you can actually point to it every time you have a discussion with somebody like the health authority or the fire brigade or whoever, and say, well, actually our residents think this is really important, and here's the evidence that they think it's really important. Because I think if not much is happening and not much is likely to happen, it's an awful slog to do a neighbourhood plan, and it may not be the best tool for you. Having said that, with the Wiltshire local plan being reviewed, I have to say, what are the chances that your status as a small village may change? I don't know. I genuinely don't know the answer to that. If you've got very few facilities, it may not change at all. But certainly that's an issue that's faced a village that I've worked with in Kent. And that's one of the reasons why they wanted to be prepared. They did some work, which then became a neighbourhood plan. But I'm sure Jeff will know the local scene better.
I don't have much to add to that. I think our problem is that it's either nowadays funded neighbourhood plans or nothing else. Like I said about design statements. They used to, when we invented design statements years ago, you used to be able to get grant aid of £5,000 to help you produce a design statement. You will all know about the days of parish and town plans. The big critique of parish and town plans was that they were just wish list documents with no evidence. Now, it seems to me that if local communities can provide robust evidence about local green space, robust evidence about traffic, robust evidence about design, a good local planning authority should be able to take account of that and use that without you having to go through the implications of a full neighbourhood plan. So we're stuck in a position where probably in some ways, if you wanted to address those sorts of issues, yes, going through a neighbourhood plan can be successful, and is probably at the moment, probably the most successful and easiest way to do it. But yes, equally, we always ask communities, is this what you want to do? Why do you wish to do it? And in many cases, certainly in Gloucestershire, for example, we had a whole round of them. We just said, don't bother, it's not appropriate for you, because they had some procedure from their local authority of getting support for design statements, say. Yeah, they could do that. But it's back to you trying to make arguments with really robust local evidence to your local authority to get those factors taken on board. And it needs to be more than the wish list period of parish and town plans to be effective.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for that, Jeff. Just a reminder to our panel, if you want to add anything, just unmute yourselves and join in, because I can't see you. We don't have a flagging system, so I'll just pause there for a second.
Sure.
Yeah.
Question from Rose Love.
No, just a second. No, just a second, Geraldine. There's somebody from the panel. Did I?
Yeah,
hear?
it's Mike Ash.
Mike, yeah.
Hi.
you.
Can I just echo a bit for what both Graham has said and Jeff's comments on it? I mean, I live in a village which is exactly the same size as Graham's. We are a small village within the settlement structure of the Wiltshire local plan. And my advice has certainly always been locally that we don't need to go through the full process of producing a neighbourhood plan. The problem is, which I think Jeff has really put his finger on, which is that lesser documents, Wiltshire used to recognise local design statements, and they don't do that now in as a part of their policy. And really, there ought to be some recognition of such things. We have one, or rather, we have a parish plan, and we have had some success, certainly, in praying it an aid when commenting on planning applications. There is some evidence that it made a difference, but it's very hit and miss. It's been one of the dilemmas with this whole system right from the start, from the time when I retired as chief planner at the department. This sort of idea of neighbourhood planning was beginning to emerge. And the problem is that if it is to be a statutory part of the statutory planning system, then inevitably it leads to the complications that everybody is referred to. And then still needs to be a role for less formal forms of plan, with some sort of standards imposed as to what they should comprise. And I think there's another element to be taken up with the department centrally about doing something about this in the future.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Mike. Okay, moving on to Rose Love, who's got a need for a new cemetery. Rose, would you like to, you talked about Wiltshire's NP, I'm not sure quite what you mean by that. Would you like to ask your question? If you unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry, my camera's over here. Yeah, we have a church-run cemetery. It will be closed for purpose in 5-10 years at the most. And we have been discussing for some time to have a council purchase some land and have a council-run cemetery. But when we had our last annual parish meeting, our Wiltshire councilman mentioned that we should have had that included in Wiltshire's neighborhood plan. Does Wiltshire have its own neighborhood plan?
No, it wouldn't have it doesn't have its neighborhood. Have a local plan. The Wiltshire, the county local plan, or Wiltshire's local plan. Maybe
that's what it was. We were just told we should have reported it, that we are in need of a cemetery.
Right.
Okay. Because if Wiltshire doesn't know about it, then that could slow down our process at some point. I was confused about the whole thing about, I don't even know who to contact.
Okay.
And how to get this need known.
I'm going to chuck this one to Jeff first, who's done some work at Wiltshire. But,
is that on the basis? Is that on the basis that I'm a bishop?
You're the one who has been working in Wiltshire, but you can pass it on if you want to anyone.
Well, I've no immediate answer. And I think you're absolutely right that it should have gone into the local plan, but the local plan timescale is such that if you miss that, if you're 6 months later, you have to wait till the next cycle to put it in. So I see no reason why an aspiration, at least, first of all, an aspiration for that should not be in the neighbourhood plan. Secondly, the issue is to search for land for that, which becomes a problem, because the likelihood is that if you're searching for potential land, that land may have other development value. If it's got development value, it makes it difficult to lever it out of the system. In one neighbourhood plan that I can't mention at the moment because it's at a slightly difficult stage, we actually worked with a local landowner to develop a site which was 50% for housing, still got the affordable housing in it, but the other 50% was to be the extension. In fact, it wasn't an extension, a nearby area of land for a new cemetery. So you can link it into the local plan.
Yeah, I think
One of the
that's what
things-
he mentioned, that
The local plan,
that's
sorry.
a way
Yeah.
for us to get the land, is to have it as an attachment to any possible builds.
Yeah, the difficulty with that is someone's basically saying to you, give us permission for housing and we'll give you a cemetery. It's a difficult balance. The other interesting thing we find that I could have said earlier is that we find in working at local neighbourhood plan level, there's something absolutely fascinating occurs. We find an awful lot of local landowners whose families have been landowners for many years in that community, who don't want to put their land through the SHELAR process for it to be developed, because they think it's going to be full of barrack housing and persimmon housing, and they don't understand that they can have a control over it if they pass it through a neighbourhood plan process. So in fact, neighbourhood plan, local landowners may actually be interested in coming forward, either for a piece of land to make it available, or for a piece of land which is a bit of housing and a bit of cemetery, if it is through a neighbourhood plan, because it is almost only through the neighbourhood plan that you can properly control that mix and balance. We get into things like covenanting of land, which we've done before for open space or whatever. So there are procedures, and I actually think neighbourhood plans are the best procedure for doing that.
We've never had a neighborhood plan because we're mostly farming. Is it still beneficial for us to have one made, to have that expense, take on that expense to get one made?
That's a very complicated question. You need to come back to us or someone afterwards, I'm afraid. Please do.
I would say do raise it with the local authority.
As well.
Given that you haven't got a neighbourhood plan, you're not actually doing one. I would say do raise it with the local authority. Get in touch with your policy planners who are working on the local plan and raise this with them. I mean, for goodness sake, I've sat in that seat so many times. The parish council comes along and says, we need this, we need that. It's really, really helpful to have that intelligence, because there may be ways that it can be worked into the local plan, even at this stage, or can be made a part of, you know, if you don't know about it, you can't do anything about it at local authority level. So I would certainly try that.
Thank you.
I would quite like to just make a sort of comment, probably Jeff would answer this, or Anna, on Rosie's question. How do you view and have you experience of allotment areas being included in neighbourhood plans? And actually talking about cemeteries, which are open green spaces. Of course, allotments are now, particularly with the climate emergency, to be considered as open green spaces. So what have you experienced, either Anna or Jeff, of neighbourhood plans who in that have included a space for allotments?
I don't believe any of the ones we've done have created them, but I've certainly heard it from elsewhere. So what I will do is I will ask my colleagues about allotments and whether they've actually been included in a neighbourhood plan. Yeah, but the second part is second part is they can, of course, be designated as local green spaces and protected.
Yeah, exactly.
The only thing I would say about their designation as local green space is that there are different types of allotments, and if there are statutory allotments, which I won't bore you with the detail, they are protected in law by a completely separate set of legislation from planning. And basically, if you want to do away with them, you have to get the Secretary of State's permission. So, or the local authority has to get the Secretary of State's permission. So if there are statutory allotments, I've had inspectors say, or examiners say, there's no point making these local green space because they are already so protected that adding another layer doesn't make any difference. So just sort of bear that in mind. They are, I think the important thing to do is to find out, if you're dealing with allotments, what the status of those allotments is in law before you start writing policies around it. Like Jeff, I haven't come across a local plan, a neighbourhood plan that specifically allocated land for new allotments. I've come across policies which protect allotments that are non-statutory, and I've also come across policies that if there is development, then a small area should be made available for new allotments, but not specifically drawing a line on a map and saying this is going to be allotments in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Right, shall we go on to the next question? This is Jonathan. Do you have a feel for the proportion of neighbourhood plans incorporating biodiversity and green infrastructure? I think he means by that a little bit possibly what we've just been talking about. So maybe Jeff on that one?
Yeah, I think we're all sitting twiddling our thumbs at the moment waiting for the Environment Bill to become an Environment Act, in which there will then be a requirement for all developments to create a net gain for biodiversity. That will be a significant move forward. There's some good guidance out there about nature and nature through design, things of that sort. But also Wiltshire have been very active recently by consulting local communities about green and blue infrastructure, because we're talking about rivers and streams as well. And they have asked all parish councils to contribute to their own county level work on green infrastructure. And that can and should be then picked up, as we've done on several occasions successfully, according to the examiners, by incorporating that and adding to it and enriching it with even more local information in neighbourhood plans. So again, there's a good example there of local plan level work and neighbourhood plan level work working together at the moment between Wiltshire and neighbourhood plan groups. Take advantage of it, please.
Excellent. Okay. Just a pause if any panel wants to come in. If not, big one this, Trowbridge. Wiltshire, one of the largest towns in Wiltshire, Trowbridge is struggling to find a reason to do a neighbourhood plan. They don't seem to work too well for large towns. We think Wiltshire will probably spend the extra 10% of the SIL on the things that the town needs and wants anyway. The cost for a fairly simple plan will be a 6-figure sum, and most of the new development will be on greenfield sites outside the town boundary. Would we be better spending our time on influencing the local plan review directly rather than doing a neighbourhood plan? Wow. Oh, back to you, Jeff, I think.
No, Anna can have a go at that one first. I'll have to think about that.
Okay.
Can I just ask the questioner, was the implication that the new development would be outside the boundaries covered by the town council? In other words, outside what would be your designated neighbourhood plan area?
Where's he gone?
Come in, Lance. Are you unmuting yourself? We can't hear you.
Fine. Seems to be having trouble.
Are you unmuting? Unmuting, but something wrong with the sound.
Let's work on the principle that what he meant was that it's outside the parish boundary.
And that's what he said in his chat. He's just put a chat message up. Right. Okay. So basically it's outside the town boundary. So the town council, if the designation was just for the town council to be the neighbourhood plan area, those developments will be outside the town. I mean, there's a number of ways forward, aren't there? One is to do a joint plan with the parish that the development is scheduled to go in, and that way the town and the parish work together to actually get a sort of an integration of the facilities the town offers with the design and the layout and all that comes with the new housing. That's definitely a possibility. And as I said, there are a number of neighbourhood plans who've actually worked to that's been the main issue in the neighbourhood plan, has just been, we want the new development to be like this. And it gives you quite a strong approach. And sometimes the local authority is quite pleased to have that, because actually it makes it so much easier for everybody, because all the engagement happens early and the design ends up like everybody wants it and it goes through. So that will be one approach. You say you're struggling to find a reason. Well, that will be one reason. Jeff, have you got any thoughts?
No, I agree with that point. I think from memory, the example maybe look at within Wiltshire was, I think, a decision by Devizes Town Council deliberately to work with some of their adjacent parishes for precisely the same argument. So they produced a joint one. A joint plan is a very good idea. Unfortunately, the point you highlight about the cost is important, Because of course, if you work as one neighbourhood plan across, let's say, 6 parishes in town and 6 parishes, you still only get the 10,000K. If I was being a total heretic, so you're not allowed to listen to this, but as a total heretic, I would suggest that the town and the adjacent parishes all submit separately as designated areas, all get the money, then all work their plans together so they're integrated, and that way you get your 6-figure sum. But I didn't say that.
Lance, do you want
to come back on that at all on the chat? Is there anyone on the panel who wants to add anything to it? No. Okay. Well, Lance. Yeah. Okay. It sounds like you're happy with that suggestion. Okay. We'll move on. Thank you.
Question from Claire Kate further up.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read it out, Anne?
Oh, is it my turn? I thought it was Trevor. Right. No, I've got it. Right, from Claire Kate. It would be helpful to hear from the panelists regarding opportunities for challenging the top-down targets for housing numbers. Well, that's a big can of worms. Who am I going to hand that to? Anna to start off, and then Jeff?
Well, I suppose the top-down housing number, the ultimate, is the 300,000 per year coming down from national level. And I don't think there's much any individual parish or town council can do to challenge that. That's got to be part of a much larger lobbying arrangement. If you're talking about Wiltshire giving you've gone to Wiltshire as a neighbourhood plan group, you've asked for what's the number you're giving us to aim at, and they give you a number, then I think that is much more susceptible to challenge because you need to know how they've worked that out. And as Jeff said, and I totally agree with him, when you actually do figures on a sort of county or a district level, you can get a reasonable figure. When you try then to drill down to local level and dish that figure out and apportion it to parishes, because they've come to you saying they want to do a neighbourhood plan, it is so much more difficult. It is so much more complicated. How on earth do you do it? There is no specific methodology, I think, for doing that, for apportioning that figure, and therefore I think it is more susceptible to challenge. The other thing is it's probably a figure which is an unconstrained figure and doesn't take account of any particular constraints you have in your parish, such as land that is liable to flood, for example. Jeff, what do you think?
It is a very difficult one because in a sense I read the question, or I hear the question as being, but we don't want anything to happen, or we want the minimum to happen, or whatever. It's not about we want more, whereas several parish councils that we've worked with have actually ended up providing more than they were given the figure for, because they've shown that that can deliver, in one case, open spaces, in another case, extra facilities. So I think by and large, your villages and towns are protected by what still will be the national perspective, which is to focus the vast majority of development on existing urban areas, down the hierarchy to very small amounts, if any, in small villages. So I don't believe there's a significant issue that will change in the government policy, particularly not with Boris Johnson saying we're not going to be building on green fields any longer. So we say a little bit too blunt, perhaps. But certainly taking Anna's point, she's dead right, is that when you get to the local level, these figures will come from anywhere, however well they do it, at somewhere like Wiltshire level or any district or authority level. They're going to be a little bit blunt, they're going to be a bit basic, and I would like them to be called indicative figures and to have the rationale for them, for you to argue with them. And as I say, we've had a number of occasions where the argument has produced a slightly higher figure, but an argument has produced a slightly lower figure, rather than a fix. You simply cannot do that type of statistical work to have it any statistical validity at parish or small town level. So it's how you address that issue. And Anna's right, you've got a lot of scope for sway and play within the indicative figure you might get from Wiltshire.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on, unless there's anyone want to come in on that. Just to note, Steve, from Scene notes that that allotments, statutory and non-statutory allotments are protected by their neighbourhood plan. That refers to an earlier question.
Yep. Okay,
now we have a question from Devices about tourism and the challenges it faces. It's disappeared off my screen, but I'm going to ask the questioner to ask it because it's I think quite a complicated one, wondering whether a neighbourhood plan or what could be done with it. So would you like to come in on that, please?
Robert Hunt Grubb.
Yeah. Right, my chat is getting stuck, so
Do you want me to read it out?
Well, I can read it for you,
Okay, Anne.
if you like. All right, so question from Robert Hunt Grubb. For Devices, tourism is seen as its economic future, fully supported by Wiltshire Council. This may not be possible because the London Road and New Park Street are already gridlocked at peak times. Appeal inspectors have overruled Wiltshire Council's opposition to development sites on every occasion. Tourism as a future is under severe threat as coaches must keep to timetables. Is there any action we can take to protect our future visions of the town? I suppose, Robert, that is in the context of you are doing a Devices neighbourhood plan and you're reviewing it or drawing one up. Maybe the questioner can answer that one before we go on. Is Robert there? Or write in the chat if you can't get on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. A lot of effort has been put into the town by Wiltshire Council to link up the wharf car park and the potential future of the assize court when the museum moves. The Wiltshire Museum will be moving there, but it is going to be very difficult if tourist coaches can't get there because that is seen as the future of the town. The problem is that the roads through Devices are extremely limited. Town planners and consultants have not been able to find a way around that. No bypass is possible if we're going to get tourists to where they need to get. So if any more development takes place, it makes the whole scheme impossible. And up till now, all Wiltshire Council's plans up the London Road, which is a key access point, have been overruled by inspectors. We are very concerned that the future economic future of Devices will be compromised by this. Have the council, the participants, any views on this? Thank you.
Can I just ask first, is that an issue that's being looked at in the neighbourhood plan? I mean, Devices has a neighbourhood plan, and that would be the sort of issue that the neighbourhood plan might pick up.
I'm sure they are. I am not part of the neighbourhood plan of Devices because I actually live in Potton and convened the steering group for Potton, which was one of the earliest neighbourhood plans of the county. So I cannot answer that question. I'm sure they are very supportive.
Okay. Anna, Jeff, anybody want to?
I'll start, but it's not very positive, I'm afraid. I think the key difficulty is because I've had this tourism one I worked a lot with Stratford-on-Avon tourism. Yep. The difficulty is that a lot of the issues you're addressing there are not issues that are part of planning legislation. They are to do with traffic and transport and coach parking and various other things, etc., and visitor behaviour, visitor information, etc. There's a whole series of things that are not part of that can't really be addressed successfully through a neighbourhood plan. So my feeling is that the lobbying and the argument should be made by your parish and Devices and others working together to Wiltshire about the position as a whole on issues around traffic and transport. And things need, just one little example, it seems silly. When working in Stratford-on-Avon on tourism there, what we found was they were big complaints about the number of coaches in the town. Not surprising, Shakespeare's birthplace, etc. Number of coaches, but what they found, we got the shopkeepers to do a survey. What they found was that it wasn't the number of coaches, it was the same coaches going round and round and round again, because nobody had ever given the coach drivers any information about where the coach park was on the edge of the town. So there are a number of ways in which you can address tourism. There are things you can put in a neighbourhood plan to promote it and support it. There's actually very little, because it's outside planning legislation, that can be done directly about it. So neighbourhood plans have a role to play, but a very minor one.
Okay, I'll just a quick question from Downton, Christopher Hall. Downton starting to update a neighbourhood plan that is 3.5 years old. When can we apply for the 10K grant, and are we eligible for the grant? Technical question there. Anna, Jeff?
I think I'd have to say, look at the locality website. Because I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. I think
if it's a made plan, you can just start a review whenever you want to.
The question was whether they'll get paid for it.
Well, you can get the grant. Yes, you can get grant aid for reviews, just in the same very, very similar way.
And I think, when can you start a review? I would say the time to start a review is when it's right to start the review.
Yes.
And there's, you know, you could start it the day after you had a made plan if your circumstances had changed dramatically. If you're finding from your monitoring, which of course you're doing, that your current neighbourhood plan is a bit out of date in some ways, that's the time to start reviewing it.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, well, watching the time, Trevor. Yeah, I think we're getting one more from Ian Berry. Yeah. So this is, would you provide a comment, panel, or make any observation regarding the value of a neighbourhood plan for a community area that in large part sits in the West Wiltshire Green Belt and the Cotswold AONB? Personal preferences for character assessment or design statement plus means consideration of strategic direction of the community in terms of socio-economic and environmental, not just development. Some of the community's resources are well past their sell-by date, not quite sure what he means by that, and suboptimal, and the need to plan for the future in terms of them. So really it's a what's the weight? Yeah, I mean, should you have a stronger plan, a weaker plan, a different kind of plan, I suppose. Anyhow, Anna, maybe?
Yeah, okay. I've actually pulled up the question on the screen so I can have a look at it. Yeah, I think given that you've got a high degree of protection already, I can see why your personal preference is for some sort of character assessment and design statement, and I would certainly go along with that. The plus bit means strategic direction of community in terms of socioeconomic and environmental, and not just development. If you want to look at things that are not about development, then as Jeff said about the traffic issue, I think what might be more appropriate there is some sort of document that you can use. It wouldn't have statutory weight in planning, but it would be like the old style parish plan. It would be based on research in your community, what your community thought was important, where your community thought it was going, and it would be much more of a sort of steering and advocacy document to be used by the parish council. That's my thinking. You've also said some of the communities are resources are past their sell-by date. I'm wondering if that means things like a parish hall or something like that, or a school or things like that that are, quote, past their sell-by date. And if all you needed was a new parish hall, then maybe you might want to think about something like a community right to build order.
Yes.
Rather than do a full neighbourhood plan.
Yeah, quite agree.
I'll just add to that briefly. Exactly that last point that Anna made is that there are other routes. Community right to build has classically been used for these around the country. It hasn't been used much, but it's been used for issues like that around the country to develop a new community facility of some sort. But don't forget that all that gives you is the basis for it. It doesn't give you the funding for it, so you need to look elsewhere. But I think now is the time for me to introduce my heretic comment about about design statements. And you're right that, as Anna said, Wiltshire, someone said earlier, Wiltshire don't actually support design statements at the moment, which is, I think, is extremely unfortunate. I cannot believe that will be the case with the National Model Design Code in place, particularly if they're not able to advance their level of work at the speed at which they are supposed to be doing at the moment. That creates a vacuum which can be filled at local level by design statements. So my heretic suggestion is to get yourselves designated. This is a lot of areas that come to us about design statements, and we just said no grant. What you do is get yourself designated as a neighbourhood plan area, start the work, get the money to do the design statement, and then cease to do your neighbourhood plan.
Very good.
Yeah.
On that note, that heretic note, we probably ought to break. I know there are one or two other questions about hierarchy, but
Trevor, we have got two more questions, obviously waiting. I did text about them. One from Mary Davis, I believe. Mary, is that right?
I couldn't see what the question was, sorry.
No, Mary, have you got a question?
Hi. Yes. I was just wondering on the feasibility of having self-build, custom-build, community group self-build as affordable written into a neighbourhood plan. I have to say, and I have to point out, note of interest, I sit on the board of NACSPA, the National Custom and Self-Build Association, but I also facilitate community group self-builds sort of throughout the UK. And there's a very, very interesting development, for the want of a better word, that's actually happening in Sussex just now, where land was left in a trust. And people are self-build, custom building on that land, but they cannot sell those properties in perpetuity at any greater than 75% of the open market value. And there must be a local connection test for those who live within such properties. And there's a huge drive going forward. There is a recently published Bacon review that was instigated by government. And there's yes, it's a review, but Gove is certainly taking a step out to look at that, because I think he does understand that there is a greater reform required and clarity with regard to planning. So I just wondered if it were possible to have this written into a neighbourhood plan to make homes affordable and to have them more as parish style smaller developments, rather than the national house builders coming in. And you will also find that people will build homes that are much more sustainable, they're much more in tune with the property they want to be in, and they'll have an excellent SAP energy performance.
Anna, do you want to?
Oh, no, sorry. I was going to say, I think the answer is yes. Jeff, do you have any comments on that? Absolutely.
Yeah, yes and no. The yes, we've had a number of neighbourhood plans, not just in Wiltshire, where we've put in policies in support of self-build, custom-build housing. What is much more difficult is to relate that effectively, and some of the other panels, some of the other panel members should come in now, relate that to community-led housing, which has the ability to have those controlled in perpetuity about the market and those other conditions, more so than you can. But actually, how much of that that process and requirement you can put in a neighbourhood plan about the actual final delivery is still uncertain. It still has not finally been resolved, so others may be able to add to it. So yes,
that's right. It comes down to the 106 agreement, doesn't it? Ultimately.
I think the other members of the panel should answer that. In principle, the policy can go in there. The question is, how far can it take it in terms of controlling the precise delivery, procedure, occupants, perpetuity issue of that housing?
Thank you.
I think we have to stop now, otherwise we're going to go over time. But what we can do...
Hold on, Trevor, Anne's just speaking, sorry.
Yeah, I just noticed that Sarah Dow, she said she's asked, maybe Sarah, you can hold on and ask your question in the second section, the open forum. So anybody who's got a comment in there that they want to ask us a question and we've run out of this time, can they come back, hold on, and come back at 12:30 when we've had our next presentation and ask your question then. We've got it recorded, it's there. So you won't miss out, but I think we must stick to our timetable, otherwise we're going to get a bit lost. Sorry about that for the moment, but I think bring it back at the next open forum.
Trevor.
Yeah, no, absolutely, that's absolutely fine. Let's break for coffee and back at 2:45. But we'll have another opportunity later to pick up some of these questions. I think we've got through nearly all of them. Yep. Did pretty well, really.
Well.
Okay. Time for,
right.
Are we logging out and then logging back in?
You can just put yourself on mute, go and make a coffee and then come back.
All right, thank you.
Turn your video off if you want. Hi, Hugh.
Hello.
Everybody's having a break at the moment, so that's why we're all quiet.
I thought I joined in that moment of maximum humiliation where my blood pressure was high because I couldn't get into the meeting, and I thought everyone was just waiting for me to say something in that way that made my mind go completely blank.
No, you've got plenty of time. It's, I think we restart at 11:45. However, it may just slip a few minutes because we had a few questions to answer. But hopefully, if you don't mind, just waiting for everybody to come back and then we'll start again.
Was it a good debate? I'm sorry I couldn't be with you. I was talking to communities about flood risk and climate change.
I think we did quite well, didn't we, Anna? Oh, you're on mute. Oh, sorry. She's on the call. Oh.
Hello, no, it's all right. Hello. Yes, I think it went fine. I'm just trying to answer that question about the need to review neighbourhood plans. I've just put something in the chat and I'm just going to put a comment. I think it did go well. Yeah, I mean, there were lots of questions and there were sensible questions, which is always a very good sign, isn't it? Mm. You know, lots of engagement. Right.
I'll try and talk about hi, Trevor. Lovely to see you. Lovely to see you. I'll try and talk a little bit about what we do or don't know about where the government will go next. So that would be
good luck with that.
I introduced it as government policy being both confusing and disturbing. Whether you can throw any light on that.
I have to say I've had Christmases like that as well, Trevor.
Oh, yeah, I've had those. Yeah, I think it slipped you about 5 minutes really, right from the beginning because not everybody had joined. So
that's absolutely fine.
And not everybody still hasn't joined. Did you have a problem coming in then, Hugh?
I had that. I wouldn't describe it as a problem because of my own incompetence with IT. I kind of now got used to the stress of not using the right place, and I'm sure it was my problem. Sometimes for some reason it just decided like you.
There has been a handful of people who have said they had problems, but the majority didn't. So I think they got a TX come up, which I wasn't quite sure what that meant.
No, I wasn't either. That was very confusing. But then I clicked a different set of buttons at random, which is what I do. Oh, right. The stress levels increase. I just click the buttons at random.
That sounds more like a woman, not. That's what I do. Sorry, I shouldn't say things like that. I do apologise.
Hello, good morning, Hugh. I've only just come back getting myself a coffee.
Oh, nice to see you. Hi.
Geraldine, on the question, the chat, though we've got a question from Sarah, who I've already told to come in later. Who is Anthony Currivan? Because I can't see his.
He's right at the top. I've gone right. Directly to him and asked him to ask it later.
I see.
Hold on.
He was one of the early ones, was he?
Very early. He was one of the first, actually.
I have a suspicion he's a student of mine from years ago.
At 10:36.
Okay, you better watch out because he'll trip you up.
Yeah,
10:36, Sam.
10:36.
I've direct messaged you and asked him to ask it again later.
There. Oh yes, about the open countryside. Yeah, well, that's fine. Okay, well we'll pick up those and any others all together in that last section. That's fine. As I expect you realise, Hugh, we ran over starting a little bit, but that's quite normal, I think, in these circumstances.
So I think we can start again, can't we? Are we ready to start again?
Is it everybody's back? Are they?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. Right. Well, then now I think Trevor, if you would introduce.
Okay.
Your contact.
Well, okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you've all had your coffees or glasses of water or whatever. My great pleasure to introduce Hugh Ellis, Policy Director at the Town and Country Planning Association, who has for a long time been at the interface, the front line with government, and he's got the scars to prove it. And it's really a chance here for Hugh to sort of give us the picture of what's going on nationally, which is quite a tall order, I realise, because it's really confusing and certainly from where I'm sitting. But given what we've been talking about this morning about neighbourhood plans, local plan, and then national policy. There's a kind of three-stage thing which gets very muddled. And I mentioned that we're going to talk to Wiltshire about the local plan, and of course they're sort of wondering what's going on nationally. We're all wondering what's going on nationally, and it's not easy to move forward. So anything that Hugh, that you can enlighten us about would be very welcome. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much. And for those of you who don't know the Town and Country Planning Association, and there's no reason why you should, we're difficult to describe, Trevor, really. I suppose I've playfully decided to describe it as what's left of the British utopian tradition. We've been around a long time, and in that time, there's always been a very powerful strand in the organisation about community participation, and in fact self-organisation as well. Communities doing it for themselves, and I think we've walked slowly but more firmly back into that territory, Trevor, over the years, and particularly at the moment. And so if you want to know where we start from in analysing what the government is up to, we start from the basis that not only is good planning based it can only be based in really drawing down on community expertise and experience and visions for people's places, but there's also a sense that that is also a fundamental part of our democracy. So when we talk about people and planning, not just talking about what makes good planning, we're actually talking about it as being a really important part of the local democratic process. It is the issue, isn't it? I'm always, when people ask me why is planning important, I'm always pointing them to Midsummer Murders, which of course is a very important planning series. And I'm always 9 out of 10 episodes of Midsummer Murders seem to involve planning corruption, which is just an indication of how important it is to people. And it's important, isn't it? It's no more than saying, it's about your local environment, your neighbourhood, your street, your home. So of course it's important to people. And interestingly, in describing where the government has reached in this debate, it took itself off on a very powerful ideological journey, only to come back to the reality of Amersham, which is to say the Amersham by-election, which is actually to say the reality that people on the ground want a voice in their own future. And if you try to marginalise that voice, it doesn't just go quiet, because you're all quite powerful, I dare not say this, quite powerful, quite loud, occasionally quite shouty people who know what you're talking about, and you're not presumably all going to shut up just because the Secretary of State tells you to shut up. And that's a lesson. So that, in a sense, is the arc of the last 10 years of planning reform. But I want to start from that principle that community participation should be an unshakable principle of our democracy, and that's why we help support the community planning sort of manifesto charter around planning democracy, the Charter for Planning Democracy idea, which kicked off about 18 months ago. So in that context, let me say a brief word about where we're up to with the government, and to lay that out. And so what we know is we had an indication, without saying too much more, of what was in the response to the planning white paper before that was pulled when Michael Gove became Secretary of State. So where we are now, Secretary of State has that response to the planning white paper on his desk and is thinking about what he wants to do with it. And nobody knows what he's going to decide, okay, as yet. The background to this is we've had two sets of planning reform. We've had the planning white paper, which was a shockingly poor document from a technical point of view, as well as being extremely challenging for neighbourhood planning and particularly difficult for people in general, I think. That was a really poor piece of work. And then at the same time, you've got the continual reform of the existing system, which is also leading to some shocking outcomes, particularly the permitted development deregulation, which, as far as I'm concerned, ends the control that most people have over their villages and town centres. You just don't have any control over what people do in those places for the most part. Great deal of uses. And that is shocking. So there's both what they might do and what they have done. And I think the problem is with the government reform process is they underestimate how angry people are about what they've already done to the system and the output and the consequences of that for people. In terms of the planning white paper and what they will do next, the response to the planning white paper is due any week and has been due any week, I think, since April. We're still waiting. Yes. So Michael Gove will tell us what he thinks. And I'll tell you what's in the current version of that, or the highlights of that in a second. And then moving on from that, we expect a new planning bill in January. In fact, the joke was last week that it'll be published on Christmas Eve as an early Christmas present for all those people who live and breathe planning. We can read it over our turkey. But I'm actually quite sceptical. I don't know about all of you, that whether or not it will appear in January, because GO's current focus is the levelling up white paper. That's also due in January. So I suspect that the planning bill will come later. So what's in it? What does the future hold? In terms of what the government were proposing, and we'll see how far they go along this journey, was a modified version of the planning white paper, taking out some of the more stupid bits that weren't implementable anyway. One of those is zonal planning. So the notion of zones is being walked away from. And that's a relief in one sense, although there is still a view that they might give increased status to the allocations that local plans have. So housing allocations might have a form of outline permission attached to them in the plan. That raises quite a lot of issues, as we all know, but it is one step back from actually declaring zones. So the big picture is there's some walking away from the worst excesses. There have been no commitments made, by the way, on whether the right to be heard in local plan examinations will be preserved, which I'm desperately worried about. That still hangs out there, and there's no one saying one way or another whether that will still be there. Local plans will be stripped down. Does this sound familiar to you all? Simplified and stripped down. I've been hearing that for the last 1,000 years. But what they intend to do this time is, and the devil is in the detail, is strip out all of your development management policies. So local plans won't have development management policy. That will all be, so far as there is any, in national planning policy framework. Don't ask me how that's meant to work, because I can't make it work for them, but that's what I'm saying. And the national planning policy framework might have a new legal status, might be adopted by Parliament to make the content of policy even stronger in relation to local decision making. Now that is a power grab, straight down the line continuation of the trend of taking power away from local communities and giving it to the Secretary of State, as if he doesn't have enough power, has enough power already, which he has. So that's quite worrying. And there'll be simplification of environmental impact assessment, but there will be some forms of environmental impact assessment. We've still not had the outturn of that process. It's meant to be a consultation about that process as well. And so the average local plan will be focused very much on allocations. And it will be accompanied by a legal requirement for a design code. And so when Conservative politicians are questioned very often, and indeed when officials are questioned about future planning reform, the answer to all concerns is, don't worry, it'll be in a design code. So I want to ask some questions about that. What is the relationship between a neighbourhood plan and a design code? What content goes where? And what can a neighbourhood plan do in relation to that? Design codes become legally required, but here's the trick. The scope of them is not legally defined. So although you have to have one, this thing called a design code is a pretty flexible beast. You know, so it's just based on some guidance the government produced. And anyway, and for those of you who've been around a little while, and I know there's nobody over 30 on this call, so obviously all of you won't have been around for very, very long, you'll ask the question, I'm sure, hang on a minute, you have to strip out all development management policies. Well, what's a design code then? It's not a set of development management policies. That's a good question, isn't it? So in other words, detail's been taken out on the one hand and reinserted potentially on the other, but it does mean that local communities have got to have a very strong grasp about what's being determined in design codes and how far that shifts power away or empowers neighbourhood planning. Okay, and I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. I just think it's a really big issue, and I do think that smart money is on, you know, is on forward with neighbourhood planning as fast as possible. It's interesting though that I don't think there's any political interest in getting rid of neighbourhood planning. I don't think there's any issue about them removing its powers, but I do think there's a risk to neighbourhood planning that it gets caught in this kind of car crash of different elements and kind of gets marginalised as a result of that unless we're careful. So we need to be clear about how these things fit together. So the new framework will be, you'll end up with a stripped down local plan, very much focused on new development areas. You end up with a design code, legal requirement for a design code for specific sites and potentially broader areas, but no mandation on what the content of that is. And you end up with neighbourhood plans. Outside of that in England, the duty to cooperate will be abolished, okay? Because it's hard, so they're going to abolish it. But there won't be any strategic planning outside the devolution settlements, county deals now being talked about, the Oxford-Cambridge arc, and obviously any existing devolution areas. So planning in London is 1 million miles from planning in Wiltshire, which will be 1 million miles from planning in Manchester. And the Oxford-Cambridge arc, and I don't know how many people maybe on this call, perhaps no one is from that patch, but of course you will have a separate top-down regional plan determined by the department in 18 months' time. And that raises big issues in that patch for those people on community participation. So taking all of this together, you end up, I think, with, rather than the system has had its arms broken, the existing planning system. It's in a very, very poor state to represent the kind of ambitions and vision and aspirations that local communities have in England. But the planning white paper would have throttled it, would have finished it. And that hasn't happened. So what we've now got is working with a system that I think will be subject to some incremental reform, could be actually very, could be significant for practice on the ground, but is likely to be less controversial. But my real fear, and why the work that you do is so important, and your voice, I think, is so important, is even if everyone relaxes, because we're not going to have zonal planning, the place of people in the planning process is unresolved. And Westminster doesn't understand the idea of people in the planning process. It institutionally doesn't understand it and hasn't for decades. And so the great task of making sure that people's voice is at the heart of the planning process in a reasonable and democratic and sensible way just lies lying on the floor. And no part of the planning reform process that I've seen, privately or publicly, deals with that. In other words, how can we rebuild public trust in planning? And no part of the government agenda is thinking about that. And I think that's very dangerous, because for me, from what I see, public trust, I didn't think public trust could get any lower in planning. From what I see, I think it's an incredibly low ebb and needs some sort of transformation to rebuild. So I think that's about 12 minutes, and you do not want a middle-aged planner talking to you for more than 12 minutes in your lives. But if there's anything I can help try and clarify, there is quite a lot more detail, obviously, about what they might do, but I just want to emphasise that at the moment, we don't know what Michael Gove will do. He's known as a smart politician. He is a smart politician. He likes eye-catching stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't, some highlights out of this. He's also a Surrey MP, though, isn't he? So I think he's perhaps unlikely to want to do radical planning reform for Surrey. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Hugh. I mean, that was a brilliant distillation in 12 minutes of what's going on. Can I just throw open? If Anne agrees, I'm going to push it a few minutes so that we can sort of catch you while you're here. One issue that we've been thinking about is, or certainly I've been thinking about, is is there scope for communities working more closely with local authorities to put their planning together, as it were, in the face of confusion at government level? What I'm saying, it's very confused at the moment. What scope do you think there is for communities or for local authorities to work more closely with their communities, to say, look, this is the sort of planning we want in this area, instead of which at the moment we have this sort of three division, communities, local government, and government, national government, and local governments often being a bit of a barrier to communities. I'm sure it varies, of course, all around the country, but I just wonder what scope there was for actually localities and areas really kind of course there's a limit legally, but actually working out themselves what they think the best planning is for their area.
Yeah, three quick responses, I think, Trevor, to that. First is that there's no doubt that delay is your enemy. Communities and local government do need to partner together to crack on and make sure they've got strong visions in place, because the government is saying, if they do have a planning bill, just as a piece of context, that within 20 months of the royal assent of the new planning bill, everyone will have a new local plan. Okay, so if that's true, and very big if that's true, this will be the most concentrated period of local plan adoption ever known in England in the post-war period. And they're saying privately that it will happen on a region by region basis. So all the local plans will be timed to happen, but review will happen together. which will create, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest opportunity and the biggest burden on community organisations has ever been, to try and shape that. In that context, Trevor, the barrier that exists between communities and local government, which is part cultural and part resources, needs to be unpicked, doesn't it? And a new and transformative way of doing local planning needs to happen. And if local authorities are wise, they'll seize the opportunity of the neighbourhood planning movement and those around it and absorb that. Not necessarily, you know, actually precisely in every terms of every policy, but what I mean is sort of culturally, to see it as a resource and to see it as something that you can build upon and see it as something that can be amalgamated together for things like citizens, juries and wider opportunities for that dialogue. But the point that needs to be reflected back to local government, as it does to central government, is that, you know, that Robert Jenrick thought he could do what he liked, but in fact local democracy got in the way. That plays out at the local level as well, doesn't it? You can't build without consent. So successful planning cannot happen unless, broadly speaking, people have had an opportunity for a voice and are content that their voice has been heard. So I think it does need a new approach. And I think the difficulty we've got is it's not clear. We've not got any guidance from government about how to make that work, Trevor. So we need to try and make that up. I would pioneer it in Wiltshire if I were you.
Yeah, well, okay, we'll have a go at that. Thanks.
I'd quite like to ask Hugh a question myself, if I may. Hugh, this is going to be, I'm afraid, straying, as it always does, out of the planning into the political. Given the time frames and the constraints which you've just been talking about how local authorities have got to meet the timetable of having completed an updated local plan, bearing in mind the advent, getting closer, of a new election, general election, how strong do you think the position is now to lobby MPs strongly on the grounds of the way the reforms are going through does not reflect the democratic process? So I'm really saying, should we be wielding the stick of Amersham a lot stronger?
Yes. And the reason I say that is because the political symbol in Westminster is that you've all been bought off. It's all gone quiet. You've all gone back to sleep. And that now that incremental measures can be made, which actually can make, as we all know, a lot of difference to the democratic planning process. So there is at the moment a vacuum. And my advice is, my non-partisan advice is, please let's have a sensible, balanced and democratic system. I've long since put down, well, I haven't really put down my utopian aspirations. I just don't talk about them very much. But that there is that real sense that what we now need is a period of calm in planning. Stop messing the system around, rebuild public trust in the system, give power back to local government, and then leave the system alone to actually begin to work itself out. I would do that. There are also some things that really worry me coming from the same think tanks that actually were behind planning reform in the first place. And some of them look like they're very democratic measures, and I would beware of them. I really would. There's a proposal, for example, that says that you should have street referendums for development. So if a street decides it all wants to put a story on its house and they all have a referendum together and they agree that they can all put one story on their house, they won't need planning permission for it. And you're beginning to see these sort of very fragmented. Now that's nuts, that idea. Why? Because it's not just the people who live on the street that are affected by the development on that street. And that seems fairly self-evident to me. You know, if you live in that town, that village, you also need to have a say about that process. So there are some pretty crazy ideas kicking out that, but my feeling is actually it's just really important to get politicians to say, don't you dare, essentially, that sensible planning reform is possible. It's been set out in detail. But no, now is the time to keep pressure on. It really is.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got a quick question for Hugh before we, yes, Kim. Unmute.
Yeah, I've actually put it in the chat. To be brief, because of all the changes in planning and etc. in Malmesbury, we set up an organisation called WALPA, which is the Wiltshire Area Local Planning Alliance, which is basically a group of about 35 odd parish and town councils in Wiltshire, representing more than half the population, excluding Swindon. So it's more, I think off the top of my head, and don't blame me if I'm wrong, it's over 200,000 residents. And for the last year or so, we have been lobbying both Wiltshire Council, MPs and what was MHCLG, particularly about neighbourhood planning, particularly about MPPF 11D and 14, which basically, because Wiltshire Council no longer can prove a 5-year land supply, means that quite a few neighbourhood plans, including that in Malmesbury, now have lost their power. And Malmesbury is a very pretty place, ancient town, and we are besieged. This is my talk going down the pan, by the way. We are besieged by developers. And if you look at the Sheila for Malmesbury, there's Malmesbury surrounded by a sea of blue, where all these developers want to build these nice estates, which are very profitable. But unfortunately, March the year before, Wiltshire Council actually allowed planning to go forward, which was outside of our neighbourhood plan because of this issue with the MPPF. So ours was the first made neighbourhood plan in Wiltshire. We were part of the government front runner scheme. And so we were already 4 years old when they changed MPPF to bring that in. So obviously we're more than 2 years old. So what the situation now is, we've gone from being plan-led, where we brought forward infrastructure, and we're actually in a situation where we've got problem with school provision, simply because incremental plannings come forward with contributions, but you end up shipping out children to a neighbouring village on a free Wiltshire Council bus because it's not plan-led. There's no actual, it's basically, you know, without...
Sorry, can you come to the question?
Sorry, the point is, it's a developer's charter. So my point is, how, Hugh, we have been trying for the last year or so to get these points across. How, Hugh, do we actually get a seat at the table and try and actually start to influence government in a positive way to bring forward? Our own MP was positive, but then fell away. So, and we get that same response from other MPs. So how do we do it, Hugh?
Okay, so there's quite a lot there, and I'll just take it really, really quick. The first thing to say is that I'm a really pro-housing planner. I am so shockingly depressed by the results that are coming out of the ground. Badly planned, badly constructed, badly located, and unaffordable housing. And a really good plan is plan-led, Kim, and that has multiple benefits in terms of infrastructure provision. But the legacy of the stuff we've built over the last 10 years is going to be shocking for us. It's going to be really difficult because it's almost all car dependent, almost all lacks key resources. It breaks every good rule of planning. It isn't planning. I just want to scream, this is not planning as I've ever understood it or was ever taught it. It's actually just chaos. And it's facilitated chaos. So it's not plan-led in that sense. So I share that frustration. It's happening all over the country and it's making people very angry. I think the difficulty is that we've got very few exemplars of really good development in this country. Actually, they are there, but it's difficult to point to. And I'm more and more convinced that actually there's a fundamental shift to community-led housing is what we need in many rural places, particularly. You need to change the development model and break open the volume house build. Now, as to the last thing, I would say, we all know, you all know, as people involved in planning, that you need positive alternatives, and there are so many of those we can put forward. But in terms of unpicking planning reform, let me confess this to you. Over the last 10 years, I have completely failed to have any influence over the course of planning reform because I can't buy myself a £50,000 seat to the leaders' table. And unfortunately, planning reform has been driven by an immense amount of very powerful lobbying from two sources, which is the strategic landowners and the development sector. And it's very difficult to compete with that as a small charity, and it's a hellishly difficult job to compete with it as a parish council. What I think is the only way of doing it is like the Community Planning Alliance and these new groupings of community organisations coming together they are having a powerful voice. And much as people sneer at parish and town councils in Westminster, and speaking as an ex-parish councillor, I always resent that when they do that. Actually, I think you have more power than you know you have. You know, if planning reform goes the right way, because of people like all of you with strong voices, actually saying that there are better ways of doing this. But I think now is the right time to keep pushing ahead. If what we need is a settlement, a planning settlement, a democratic settlement, and I would love to see basic democratic rights described for the planning process in law, which are immovable and cannot be ripped out by a Secretary of State. Those are the sorts of things that we need. We need to argue for that. You need a defined voice. And if you want one thing, well, that probably is things like third-party right of appeal for any development not in line with the plan, for example. Those are the sorts of things that politicians need to think about, have been thinking about for years. Those are the sorts of right-based mechanisms. Well, sorry to go on, but it's important, isn't it?
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Thank you. So, anybody else got a burning question? Because I think Hugh's, we're running a bit late already. We don't want to curtail the 3 parishes that are going to tell us about their experiences. So, any quick other question directly to Hugh on strategic and government high-level issues? Anybody? No. All right. All right then, Hugh. I think, thank you very much. I mean, as ever, whenever I hear a talk from somebody like yourself, I come away with a mixture of optimism and depression, and I'm never quite sure which one's going to win. Anna wants to say something. Yes.
No, I didn't want to say anything. I was just giving a thumbs up indication. That's all. Just a reaction.
Okay. Right.
Yeah. Me too. Thanks very much, Hugh. That was terrific, and really, I think, cuts to the heart of what we're trying to get at here. So
well, thank you all very much, Trevor, and to all of you. Please don't give up. So what you do is important. It really is. And just ignore Westminster and crack on.
Okay, we'll do that. That's brilliant.
Right. Thank you. To the barricade.
Thanks, Hugh. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
All right. So now we need to move on, Trevor, and we're going to start with, I think, a joint presentation from 2 parishes. Is that right? About
I think it's Scene first.
Scene first.
Stephen Ball.
Right. So, right.
Okay, we're unmuted. Hi, I'm a board member of the Scene Community Land Trust, and around about 2015, I was involved in the very early stages of neighbourhood planning in Scene. The neighbourhood plan in Scene took a very long time, but it is now a made plan. The part of the neighbourhood plan process was a little bit of training, and I think Community First organised a seminar in Devizes, and I think Stephen Walker may have had input. Ian Crawley may have had input there. In fact, Ian Crawley turned my Community Land Trust light on, really, and it was only after that meeting that I actually sat down and read the Localism Act 2011, and I realised that as part of the empowerment that my community was going to get, we could form a CLT, but that empowerment would come out of neighbourhood planning. The people that were involved in neighbourhood planning at the time didn't really share my vision, unfortunately. And so I split off with Nigel here, who's right next to me, and we decided that we could see that the neighbourhood plan was going to deliver. But we were also aware that we had approaches from predatory developers with their dismal design, to use a quote, and it looked as though our parish was going to be urbanised. The secondary threat in all of this, of course, was the urban sprawl from the developing area of Melksham. We're featured in the southeast of Melksham. We're sat on our hill in Scene. We can see Melksham marching towards us. And every winter evening, if you go out, every time the leaves fall, I do go out and sit in the landscape and I go and look at the march of the lights, the LED lights, as they come towards us. And so that vision that we had at the time, that we would be subjected to A, urban sprawl, and B, predatory development, was quite a threat. And so we galvanized the parish. And I have to say that neighbourhood planning, it shouldn't be seen as a bureaucratic chore at all. It's actually an opportunity. And it's an opportunity that neighbourhoods, that parishes particularly, should grasp and just get on with it. The early community engagement was one of the things that gave birth to the Community Land Trust, but it was also something that supported the neighbourhood plan. So these are compatible activities, if you like. Although it's quite something to ask a small group of volunteers on a parish level who are engaged in neighbourhood planning to kind of pick up the thread of Community Land Trust work. It's just impossible to do it. So we formed, we call it People's Republic of Scenes splinter group, and we created and very quickly incorporated the CLT. And we're fortunate in our parish to have some really good people who, business advisors and whatever else, who got us incorporated really quickly. But the other fortunate thing is that we made some good contacts within Wiltshire Council. And from our perspective in Scene, we watched Wiltshire Council evolve from advisors like Vicky were assigned to us, and we then saw the creation of a hub, and then that evolved into homes of our own. And we have had excellent support. They really got on board with it. So I can't really say that we've lacked support, whereas I think probably neighbourhood planning may have lacked support. We were absolutely fine with it. And we found that we made contact, we networked with people within the council and within Community First who shared our vision. And they provided nothing but encouragement, and obviously in some cases, the route to financial support as well. So we found that we moved along very, very quickly, and within a year, we had 250 members, and we were up and running. We didn't need any technical support. We engaged a very good architect. But one of the things that I think is really significant now, looking back, particularly with COP26 almost behind us, is that we insisted that the housing association that we partnered with adopted a passive house standard for any houses that we might build. And we figured that because we were trying to solve a problem of housing shortage for people who couldn't afford to build houses themselves and couldn't afford to buy in our parish, it's well over £100,000 a bedroom in our parish. We felt that if we're going to offer housing to people who are at the challenged end of the economic spectrum, then those houses should be of highest quality possible and as cheap to run as possible. So those families, as people who occupied those houses, would have disposable income to move on from CLT housing and maybe find themselves on a property ladder somewhere else. But as our progress as we rolled along, we just steamed along. We had great community support. We did have some community dissent, but it wasn't hugely significant. The small amount of the dissent that we had is they make a disproportionate noise, to be quite frank. The majority of the folks in the parish wanted it, and the majority of the CLT members wanted development. And it was very small, and it was designed just to meet our defined housing need. And we took care along the way to make sure that we established and reaffirmed that need all the way along the line. Our big stumbling block came when we got to the Section 106 agreement. And we were advised by White Horse Housing Association that the Section 106 would be a big problem. And I didn't take any notice of that comment, really. I thought, well, because the National Community Land Trust Network has got a Section 106 template, and there are lots of examples, and there are case studies where people have found it really easy. And in fact, we visited Tolla in Dorset and had a neighbourhood plan of just 13 pages, and they just, you know, they got a 106 done and they built a really nice little development, and it seemed easy for them. But when we got to our section 106, we just ended up in a quagmire. Eventually, we managed to get there. I mean, the reasons for the section 106 delay was simply because Wiltshire Council didn't understand what was going on. They didn't understand the concept of community-led housing and the place of the 106, section 106 in that. So they've found great difficulty in formulating a 106 that we could live with. Anyway, we got there in the end. It's not
12 months later.
It's not ideal. It took over 12 months to get there, but we're there now. And unfortunately, COVID and the economic difficulties have slowed us down. And we're now in a situation where we would have expected to have started now. We've done soil tests and whatever else. We would have expected to have holes in the ground, and we're not going to have that until the springtime. And I have just seen this week one of the families in our parish that one of these houses might have served, because they're on the waiting list. I've seen that family move out to a neighbouring conurbation because they simply can't afford to be here, and the delay has caused them to move out.
On the original schedule, we were due to have these affordable houses occupied this Christmas. It's going to be probably spring 2023 now, basically due to bureaucratic obstruction.
Yeah, but we can't gripe about that really, because we have got where we intended to go. We just didn't get there in the timescale that we thought we might have. But in all, all I can say is that Wiltshire Council, we broke the ground for the first real CLT, if you like, and its development. But the people who are following behind us should find it a lot easier, and I hope they do. And if the people here from Wiltshire Council are listening, they need to concentrate on making that easier.
Thank you, Stephen, and a lot of lessons to be learned there, and congratulations for getting through on that. We'll crack on, but there'll be a chance for the questions at the end. But we'll crack on to Broad Chalk. I think it's Ashley Trueluck, if he's there, ready to go. Oh, unmute yourself.
Unmute. Right.
We are delighted to give some feedback in terms of lessons learned from our experience. We've just had our plan ratified, and it's now being implemented. I just say something about myself and Broad Chalk first of all, because it's quite relevant. I come from a background of strategic planning. I run the county community foundation. You'd think. And our village is full of really highly qualified people, legal, town planning, all the rest of it. You'd think as a team, we would have found this exercise easy. It wasn't. My point really is the whole process, as somebody who spent his life in strategic planning, is incredibly overcomplicated. It could be simplified. It's just bonkers. However, we got there and we enjoyed the ride. Broad Chalk is a very community-minded village. We're in a conservation area. We are full of marvellous volunteers coming up with bright ideas, and the point of doing a plan in our case was twofold. One was to somehow prioritise and coordinate all those volunteer initiatives which were wrapping all around the place, competing with each other. And secondly, as a conservation village, we wanted to make sure that we didn't atrophy as a sort of retirement village on the one hand, or become a holiday village on the other. We want to stay as a working village with housing for local people. And there's an awful lot of young people who can't afford to live in the village at the moment. And it's them that we're trying to help. So our aim really was very much in accordance with the original aim of community plans. I use the word community because I hate the word neighbourhood. It's a very Americanism, but anyway, I'm a community man. But it very quickly became apparent with the addition of the word development between neighbourhood and planning, that what Wiltshire Council were looking at was very much a housing plan. We fought against that gently all the way through and insisted it's a community plan, though it must address things like environment, amenities, road safety and all of it. And housing is just one strand of all that. So really what, in terms of lessons learned, the first one is the balance of all the differing factors and stakeholders are involved in this game, because to a large extent they're pulling against each other. They've got different agendas, and your role as chairman of a neighbourhood planning team is to somehow balance those all out. The main conflicts of interest or the stakeholders are, first of all, your own parish council. We're a small village, 600 souls, on the one hand. Secondly, the community itself. And thirdly, the county council. The community, because they are used to organising, certainly at a small village level, things bottom up as volunteers. The parish council, because they're trying to retain control. And the county council planning department, who've seen neighbourhood plans used, perhaps I'm a cynic here, or maybe I'm a realist, who've seen neighbourhood plans used as an excuse to pare down the professional expertise in neighbourhood planning, in housing planning departments, and therefore see us as a bit of a threat. The trick is to manage all this really so that you get creative tension rather than a conflict and en passe. So just taking those one at a time, the parish council, we thought it was important that if you're running a neighbourhood plan, the plan must come bottom up from the neighbourhood, from the community, rather than top down from the parish council. So I am not a member of the parish council, but the planning team I have is a mixture of parish councillors and experts and representatives from within the village. That includes a national standard town planner, a very highly qualified legal guy, and environmental experts. So really the trick was to work with the parish council so we didn't seem to be a threat to them. As far as the community is concerned, we have said all the way through that it's not our plan, it's not the PC's plan, it is the community plan. And we started the whole process by asking the community what they wanted. We tried not to come with our own agenda, and we put out an open-ended questionnaire, and we got fantastic feedback. Over 80% of the village adults, households, sorry, replied to that questionnaire. And we got, luckily, a very strong consensus on what was required. We basically said, where do you want to be in 10 years' time? And what do you want? What do you see as your needs for amenities, for housing, and for the environment? We then analysed that and fed it back to the community and said, this is what I think you're telling us. Have we got it right? And they said, yep, or that we fine-tuned it. And then we produced a straw man paper all the time in that paper, quoting what people had told us verbatim, so they could recognise their own words coming back to them, and showing the audit trail of the analysis based on the questionnaires that they'd fed us. We tried to make sure that whatever went in that plan contained practically no original thought by us. It was really, we were the editors of what the community was telling itself. And that was very powerful in terms of selling the whole idea. We wrote a straw man paper, we put it up on the village website, and that then produced a first draft. We then called the first of 4 annual village meetings, incredibly well supported. The first one had pretty well the whole village there. Over the time of the 4 or 5 years of the plan, it's dropped away. There's been a bit of fatigue, neighbourhood planning fatigue, which is something you've got to watch out for. But the plan has evolved bottom up all the way through. We've sent out monthly updates all the way through. Annual meetings, as I said. We formed project groups to look at sites, housing needs, and we formed a community land trust, which has been a great success. And we've also tried and succeeded in the whole process, because it's been a long process, to keep people interested, to dangle carrots, to get some quick wins. We've saved our village shop and post office. It actually won the prize for the best village shop in UK. We've put in a causeway path linking the two sides of the village. We've built a village green, all with money we've raised ourselves, £1 million, but all within the framework of a neighbourhood plan, to show people that neighbourhood plan isn't just a plan, it's actually producing good for the community. As far as the relationship with Wiltshire Council is concerned, I echo what the previous speaker said. Generally, they've been very helpful, but I just detect a sort of cultural problem there, that there is a bit of professional jealousy. They've seen cuts to planning departments, and now they're being asked to defer to what they see as a bunch of amateurs writing planning, which was previously done by the experts. It cuts no ice at all to point out that in our team, I am a national planner. I've got national town planners and legal people on it. We're probably more experienced than the actual county planning department, man for man, but that's not the point. Nor does it cut any ice when you add up what all the experts on our very highly qualified local team would have charged for their consultancy rates, and therefore what it saved the taxpayer, because what it saves the taxpayer is in turn a threat to civil service jobs. So a very sensitive dynamic there. I'd say that in terms of liaison, we got more out of the more junior members of the staff at Wiltshire Council, the link officers, than the more senior ones who are rather more set in their ways. But of course, the link officers, in the course of the 5 years we've done it, we've had 5 different link officers, and each time a new link officer comes along, they've got a high degree of discretion as to how they interpret the rules, and the more junior ones don't really understand the rules anyway. And by the end of the process, we were telling them the rules. So that was a bit unsatisfactory, really. Almost there. The biggest challenge with the process itself, as I hinted, is labyrinthal and littered with poo traps all the way through. And of course, you've got to learn a completely new language as a layman, and you don't get much help with translation, and the rules keep changing all the time anyway. So keeping up to date and knowing which documents are current has been a real challenge. And we eventually, despite the fact they had a lot of expertise on the team, we actually simply outsourced it all. We took full advantage of the extremely generous grants that are available, and the guidelines. We spent a lot of time reading the guidelines. We brought in consultants to do the technical support, the searches, the site surveys, help us set up the Community Land Trust. And the Community Land Trust itself, by the way, if you team up with the Community Land Trust, they themselves can bring in a lot of expertise. Our lifesaver was teaming up with Place Studios, who are brilliant. And I know a lot of other people have used them. I would certainly recommend them. We realized the best thing to do was not to try and get them to edit our plan. We simply told them what we wanted to achieve and the style we wanted it in, and then left them to write it. And there was a very good dynamic. I have unbounded enthusiasm. They had unlimited expertise, put those two together, and it worked extremely well. So that was that, which brings us finally to the referendum. One thing you've got to realize when you're doing a plan, you can get carried away with the experts and the consultation and writing the plan itself, and forget that over time, people who are not directly involved get neighbourhood plan fatigue, as we call it. You've got to keep them engaged all the way through. We've done that with annual meetings, monthly updates, as I say. But when it comes to the referendum, you've really got to fire up that initial enthusiasm that you had 5 years before. And that requires quite a big ramping up of the sort of PR exercise within the village. We had a final meeting, made sure refreshments were laid on. So there was literally a carrot for people to come, well not carrots, but cream cakes. And to make it fun, we had a good turnout. We reminded people, because they'd forgotten, that the neighbourhood plan includes great chunks, verbatim chunks of their comments in boxes called "This is what you told us," and also it has the audit trail of where all the evidence has come from. They needed reminding of that, but once they'd seen it, you know, the old enthusiasm was back. Once they realised they had written the plan, not us or the parish council. We letterboxed everybody in the village to remind them to come along to the referendum with a folder with the little Kitchener poster, Broadshaw needs you. And we unashamedly used scare tactics and said, you know, basically it's not just the opportunity that this presents, but actually what's more important, if we do not do this, everybody, this is the threat that we have as a conservation village of just simply being overrun. And those two together produced what Wiltshire Council told us was a record turnout. You heard earlier that turnout is normally low. We weren't ganged up with any other local elections, but we had 65% of adults, some of them bringing proxy votes for their partners, turned up, and a 96% vote in favour of the neighbourhood plan, which I understand is a historic record in Wiltshire. But that needed quite a big, as I say, PR exercise in that final bit. You assume if you're running it that you know it all, but you forget that people who haven't been involved have moved on to other things in the meantime. So that was it. And finally, implementation. This is where keeping in touch with the parish council throughout is really important, because at the end of the day, you've written all the work and you pension off your team, and then it's down to the parish council, many of whom weren't involved in the process or were new. I found that working with the clerk to the council is really important, and getting across to him the concept that that running a parish council is not just a tick box exercise of being reactive to planning applications and so on. It's a proactive process of looking ahead and planning ahead. Now, when they have a parish council meeting, every councillor has in front of him the neighbourhood plan, and they use that as a checklist. I very carefully wrote into that parish, into the neighbourhood plan, an action plan at the end. 3 of the actions we did ourselves as the neighbourhood plan team. I've mentioned them. And then the remaining 3 actions are for the parish council to implement. And so we stand back, and we're now in the role of subject matter experts, if you like. But it's for the parish council to lead on. We've had a bit of feedback saying, well, this is not our job to take action like this. We simply are here to check the agenda each. Well, we've got out of that mindset. Reminded the parish council that in the plan, you've got in the action plan, within the neighbourhood plan, you've got a series of things which are basically oven ready. You simply need to remind Wiltshire Council that it's now their policy, the various recommendations in there, and all you've got to do is call them off and for them to set a priority. We have a tradition in the village that we raise an awful lot of money ourselves and then use the money to match fund what Wiltshire Council will put, and that is a very good way of leaving yourself up the priority list for priorities for projects in the county. So that's it. Hope that was helpful. I've covered about 1% of what's happened in the last 5 years, but I'm very happy to cover the other 99% in questions. Thank you.
All right. Right. Well, I thank you very much for that. We'll quickly move on now to Kim Power, who's going to see Campbell's there as well. Between the two of them, tell us about Malmesbury's history. We're going to have to watch time a bit, both of you, because we're running out of the other part of the time for people to ask questions. So can you keep it quick, please?
Okay. Well, I see a lot of familiar faces here. My name is Kim Power, and I'm the Deputy Mayor of Malmesbury, and I'm the lead on neighbourhood planning in Malmesbury. I'm not going to go through everything that Ashley has been through, because that's basically going to be a very similar experience for everybody, and it was for us. I'll just give you a quick intro. if you don't know Malmesbury, we're a small but very ancient market town in the north of the county with about 5,000 residents. In 2011-12, we were faced with a lot of developers who were seeking to build large numbers of housing, plus 2 new supermarkets. And they were in greenfield areas, basically. And we didn't feel they were appropriate. It wasn't that we were NIMBYs, because we wanted housing for our children and improvements to the town, but in the right areas, which is the whole point of what we're talking about, and with accompanying infrastructure, such as school provision. So basically, as I explained before, we wanted plan-led development, something planned, not just developers building housing on the outskirts and hoping that the infrastructure would sort itself out. So when the Localism Act came along, which gave communities the right to shape where they live, we absolutely snapped at the chance of that. When I say we actually work, there's 3 parishes who work together, two adjoining parishes, and it has worked. There have been at times maybe people coming from slightly different directions on certain issues, but we've been able to work together and come up with a really cohesive plan. In fact, it took a lot of work, took over 3 years, and we allocated more than 300 new houses in 1 large and 3 smaller sites, which have either been built or they're just about to be built. And we had 2 potential supermarkets that developers wished to build. We didn't have the capacity for more than 1, and we worked with the developers on all of this, both housing and supermarkets, and we ended up with 1 in the right place in the town, on the edge of the town, which was right for Malmesbury. So a lot of everything's been said, so I won't go over all that, and it will cut down the time I'm taking, Anne. But just to say, one point is that we were a front runner. We were one of the first, and so we benefited from the government's front runner scheme. And we actually had locality, planning aid, the design council, and actually the Prince's Trust, Prince Charles's Trust for the built environment help us. And we looked holistically at the town, not as trying to stop development, but to bring the right kind of development forward. So we worked with landowners and developers, and everything as part of that process is a big plus. It really is a big plus. So we were the first to be made in Wiltshire in 2015, and ours runs till 2026, and I would say it was worth all that hard work. And we wrote most of it. We did all the work on it, bar a sustainability appraisal and a landscape assessment, which we had to buy in, but the rest of it, the work was all done by local people. Excuse me. So moving forward to 2019 now, government changed the goalposts with the NPPF, as others have talked about. So the downside to neighbourhood planning is that in some circumstances, your neighbourhood plan will have much less weight in planning decisions than you anticipated. In fact, if it's more than 2 years old and it's part of the set of circumstances where there's no 5-year land supply, which there isn't in Wiltshire at the moment. So we had gone in that instant from being encouraged as part of the government's front runner scheme to actually being penalised for being one of the first to make the effort to do the thing. So yes, having a neighbourhood plan does usually mean planning permission won't be given for development outside of your plan. And that's important. It's not, because your plan is development led. And unless your community wants to see the area grow in that way, why would you want speculative development on outskirts or inappropriate places? Excuse me. So I'm moving on, just going to skirt over that bit because of time. So for us in Malmesbury, this is now, as I said before, resulting in a situation through incremental planning, which was not in our plan, but Wiltshire Council gave permission for. We're now in the situation where some of our primary school children are bused on a Wiltshire Council free bus out of Malmesbury into a neighbouring village school. And that's because it's not plan led. It's been imposed. So is there a solution? Well, yes, maybe. So as I said, ours was made in 2015. We are now at the point where how do we make our plan fall into the 2-year rule? Well, that is to officially review the plan, and I believe we're the first to go through the process again in Wiltshire, to actually go through the process. I know other people are doing it, but to actually go through the process. So basically you can renew your plan to make it within the 2 years through a review, but part of that review means you have to allocate more housing, or you have to modify it in such a way that you are adding development to it of some kind for it to count. And that's the bottom line of it. So there's 3 ways, there's 3 levels to do this. You can look at your plan and decide, is it effective? Yes. Is it still producing? Yes. Does it need updating? No. There's no modifications or anything's just small, and Wiltshire Council can do that, but that doesn't give you any added weight. The second level is being looked at by an inspector. An inspector can look at a modification to an existing policy. So for instance, one of our modifications is a developer that we've given that we wanted to build on a certain site has actually managed to reconfigure it to add in extra housing, which includes small apartments for sort of suitable for like first-time buyers and things like that. So we actively support that. So we're amending our plan to up the numbers on that, because ours is plan-led. We started with a site. The site was important. The numbers came out of that site. An inspector could look at that and say, well, this isn't a completely new thing. It is just a modification. I've got the authority to be able to approve that. This would be the best case scenario, because it would bring your plan up to date. It would be new again, but you wouldn't have to do the next bit, which is the top level, which is go through the whole process again, including referendum. So it would be like making a new plan, essentially. So I'm telling you this now because this is what we've discovered. Campbell's on the call here. Many people know him as well. We work together quite closely. So we started our review in 2019. We've now gone through our informal consultation. We went through, we checked the policies. We said, are they still effective? Are they still developing? Yes, yes, yes. So that MPPF, the 2-year thing, doesn't have any qualification on whether your plan is developing or whether your plan is rubbish and not developing. There's no qualification on that at all, which is crazy, really. Anyway, so, and I understand, ironically, the reasoning behind government actually making those changes is because of people using that to stop development. But when I've looked at the figures, I've only found that neighbourhood planning brings forward development, especially in areas that were resistant before. So, you know, to be cynical about this, I really do think it's just because it's developers and they don't necessarily want to build where you want them to build, on sites that need clearing or whatever. They like to build on nice greenfield sites, which are not necessarily connected to the town. They don't have the infrastructure, yada, yada, yada. We've all been there. So,
right.
I just
think,
conclude.
All right, sorry, we're running out of time, Kim.
Yeah, I'm coming up to my conclusion now. So I have mentioned this before. We do feel in Malmesbury that it's important to go forward, to continue with the review of the neighbourhood plan, not to give up. But over the last year, as Anne knows, and others on this call know because they are part of it, we have, with Campbell Ritchie, who leads it, we've developed an organisation, an alliance. Organisation is a bit strong. We have no rules. We're basically an alliance. So with the WALPA, the Wiltshire Area Localism and Planning Alliance, we represent, as I said before, about 35 or so parishes, which covers more than, I think, 200,000 residents. And we have written all the way through from the newspapers to Wiltshire Council, to our MPs, to the Secretary of State, to government, bringing forward our concerns about neighbourhood planning, how to make things better, etc., etc. And I can see a lot of people here already belong to that. And I would urge any other parish or town council that's involved in neighbourhood planning to come forward and contact us and be part of this, because as Hugh said, our strength comes from our collective voice. So I do believe neighbourhood planning is important. Currently, both Campbell and I are involved in 3 planning appeals for new sites for a new site in Malmesbury. We have got to speak at planning, a public inquiry in November. We are continuously being targeted by developers who want to build on our greenfield sites. And like everyone else, we are doing our best to support our town and keep it the right place in the right way for our residents. So thank you very much. And if anybody's got questions, I'm absolutely happy to answer any, as I'm sure Campbell is.
Thank you very much indeed, Kim, and indeed all the contributors. Well, as everyone's seen, we're running out of time, but it's been fascinating stuff. I think let's quickly go to some of the chat questions which perhaps remained unanswered. I think there was one, what was it, Geraldine, right at the beginning? Somebody had
Anthony Caravan.
Yes. Can you read it out? I'm looking for it at the moment.
Anthony, are you online? Anthony?
Yes, hello.
Would you like to ask your question? It'll be easier.
Sure, okay. Well, we're a very small parish in Cliff Pipard near Wilton Bassett. We are actually designated as open countryside, so we have not necessarily going to have any housing requirement imposed, but there is always a threat. So I just wondered what experiences others have had in similar situations in regard to allocating housing, should it be needed for affordable or other purposes.
Does anybody have any comment on that?
Hello,
if
Jeff.
not, maybe Jeff? No?
Well, no, I'll chip in. Yeah, there will always be those pressures there, and appropriate pressures to some extent on a certain amount of housing. And of course, if you're looking then for affordable housing, you've got the options of exceptions housing outside a settlement boundary. I'm guessing even though it's small, there'll be a settlement boundary. You can do that. And actually those exceptions are quite wide ranging. We've been through a very interesting example in another neighbourhood plan in Wiltshire, where we've actually found a site which technically doesn't qualify as an exception site. It's not out immediately adjacent to the settlement boundary, but it is arguable in a number of ways and do that. But it is also a question of looking at perhaps those occasions where that bit of affordable housing needs to be or has to be underpinned by a bit of market housing. And that's where it gets more difficult. I certainly think that if you're pursuing affordable through the exceptions route, then I think you're absolutely correct to start looking and working very closely with an established community land trust or the association, or looking at a community land trust for yourselves. That is the way that you will deliver affordable housing in perpetuity. It's the only way to do that, frankly.
I've got another question here for Jeff. For me in Mitchell, thoughts about the balance between volunteer unpaid and professional paid contributions to neighbourhood plans. That must be something you come across quite a lot.
It is, and I'm always, well, like a lot of my colleagues, always reluctant to put that sort of sweat equity figure on voluntary time, because that's not why volunteers do it. It just, by putting that figure, it just gives you a sense of the value of that. And certainly, I mean, as Ashley and others will know, when we're working on neighbourhood plans, we try to encourage the community to do as much of that work as possible. So in Ross-on-Wye, I know it's a big town, in Ross-on-Wye, we had about 150 people out doing serious community engagement work, serious survey work, serious evidence collection work that would have cost us a fortune to do and that the grant would never ever have covered. So it's not just a question there of saving money, it's the fact that you then get many more people involved in it, many more people aware of it, and it is closer to becoming what Ashley said, which is their plan rather than the consultant's plan. And the whole aim is to make sure it becomes the neighbourhood's plan, not ours.
I totally agree with that, Jeff. And just to clarify what I said earlier on, yes, get as many of the volunteers involved as possible. It's at the final stage when you're actually writing a thing and have to use the accepted language and quote the accepted policies that we need people like Place Studios to add that veneer of expertise at the top.
We give it the appropriate level by calling it planner speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, can I move on to the next question? Sarah Dow. Question, is there a sliding scale of the weight of different kinds of plans given by Wiltshire Council Planning, e.g. NP at the top and an existing village design statements at the other? What are all the things in between? So somebody give a quick thumbnail answer to that one.
Do you want me to try that one? Ever so quickly. If you go and look at the National Planning Policy Framework, you will find that it does set out quite a lot, as does the guidance, on the status of different plans. So that's about formal plans. The development plan in law is the primary plan, which is mainly the local plan and any made neighbourhood plan. And as plans, whether it's a local plan or a neighbourhood plan, get further and further through the process, so they have what's called more weight. And they can, almost anything can be taken into account as a material consideration in making a planning decision. And that means that all those things that are not bits of formal plan can be used in some way. So evidence that you've done on your neighbourhood plan, perhaps a village design guide that you did some years ago, but nothing's changed since, heritage statements, they all have some weight, but they don't have as much weight as the formal development plan. That's a real quick answer to an incredibly complicated question.
Can I just give an intermediate to that very, very quickly indeed? Again, yes, you've got local plan, neighbourhood plan. A large number of authorities across the country accepts design statements, design guides as supplementary planning documents.
That's very true, actually.
It doesn't mean that a design guide will not be a material consideration, but it gains added clout if it can be a supplementary planning document. Unfortunately, Wiltshire don't accept them as such at the moment. I do believe that will change as they start taking account of the National Model Design Code.
And I think we're going to have to draw. I think we're going to have to draw a line now.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. I think we are. Yes.
I'll just say a few brief words, and then you could, I think first of all, it's been an incredibly rich amount of material today from the speakers, and I'd like to, especially from the three local examples in Wiltshire. I think that was really interesting what was gone. A lot of messages there. I said at the beginning, we'll take this forward locally and nationally as well. So I think you know, the story doesn't stop here. I think it's excellent. Very big thanks to all the speakers and all the questioners. Terrific stuff. Sorry we couldn't get through them all. I think we've done quite well actually, but we said that we wouldn't be able to get through them all. There are a few others, but we will pick up this afterwards. But thank you all very much, and I'll pass over to Anne.
Yes, indeed. Repeat, thank you very much for everybody attending, let alone our speakers and those answering the questions, because I think it's the experience of those who are in the process of doing this, have had their experience, will prepare others to follow. I think the real, as in the chat, it says from Stephen, the lesson to be learned, he's quite right, is the creation of a power base in Wiltshire for all of us, the community, to represent our democratic voice. And that was back to my question, which I put actually to Hugh, was how much of a political stick should be wielding at the moment. We should be wielding not just at national, CPRE national level, or even higher up the chain, but here locally. But of course, what we have to do when you approach your MPs and those who are in influencing situations, positions, is to have your evidence and make the evidence clear, because MPs do actually think about the future and their seats a bit, and they, you know, we're all going to be around here maybe longer than them, so perhaps they ought to contemplate that. So anyway, on that point, thank you very much for all coming, and if this is considered a success, who knows, we might have a continuation, a follow-up meeting in a few months' time when we're a little bit further into understanding what government actually intends to do, or should I say, Mr. Gove. So on that point, thank you very much, and goodbye from the team. Thank you.